Greetings, this is yours truly, Lord Karo, welcome to my domain. In Illusionary Power Part 3 234 Chapter 8, A Message. A.N. I'm glad the last chapter was as well received as it was. Thank you all for the support. Reviews will be at the end. I know that I've recently been really apologetic in my notes here about my grammar mistakes, but I just want you to know that I really do mean that. I've been going through chapters with some people and they're helping me identify any mistakes, because sometimes I'm just too blind to notice them at first glance. This chapter will feature the pro-hero arc, along with a few other things. Following this, do not expect things to follow the canon manga storyline. I will start improvising and changing things, making things more original. I should probably also say that you're not going to be fed a lot of those big illusion-type battles. If you do too much, it gets too old, too repetitive. He's only going to do it when he needed to, and the first one may be soon, I'm not sure. Also, Izuku's warehouse is purposely a mystery. You're not supposed to know a lot about it. Stuff about it is supposed to seem confusing. I plan to have an arc about all of this later where you learn exactly what Izuku's warehouse is and how it functions. You'll get snippets here and there regarding rooms and stuff, but never its entire layout. Current Sinister 6 lineup: Izuku Midoriya, Mysterio. Izumi, Eri, Midoriya, Scorpion, League Spy. Associates: Gentle Criminal and La Brava. The new member will be revealed in this chapter since I feel like there's no need to keep it a secret. This chapter took a while due to the fact I was, and still am, entirely unsure about how it would be received. This chapter is very, very dark. Mysterio will prove his point in a very violent way in this chapter. I hope it's still to your liking. I love seeing you guys guess and theorize in the reviews about who people are, what certain things mean, and all that stuff. I really do like that. It makes me think you guys are getting into the story and are actively contemplating things when you read it. That makes me happy, as someone who aims to be a writer. So, yeah, I love your reviews, enough said. Warning: this chapter contains scenes that may be uncomfortable for some viewers, viewer discretion is advised. Shigaraki Tamura was pissed off. He stood in front of a towering figure which looked down upon him and his downed teammates. He glared up at it in defiance, while the towering giant held Mr. Compress in his left hand and looked down at him. Nothing had gone his way. Absolutely nothing. First, those brats from UA had beaten him, then the Nomu he brought was defeated and lost. Those kids made him scared and he hated that. The Hosu attack was shit too, that didn't work and Stain gained even more publicity. The only things he gained after that were some teammates. Then the forest attack, at first it went well, he captured the explosion brat, but then the heroes came and ruined everything. Then, as if things couldn't get any worse, his master got captured, then they couldn't get their hands on that bastard Chisaki. Some asshole had gotten to him first and killed him before they had a chance to deal with him and take the finished product, which was also gone. While in hiding, Kurogiri had asked him if he could leave in search of a certain power his master left behind for him. He granted Kurogiri permission to leave, but then he got captured by the police. Now he was without Kurogiri. At first, when this thing showed up he had been fascinated. The things had shown up out of the ground and he figured it was the power Kurogiri had been sent to retrieve. But it wanted him to prove his worthiness as All for One's successor. That brought him to where he was now. He and his league in beaten shambles under the boot of the giant beast. They were at his mercy, essentially. Disappointedly, the heat cried out to his master which made Tamura even more angry. He threw Compress to the ground, wailing in the air to his master. He kept asking the air why his master had chosen such weaklings. Even tears started to form from the hulking creature's eyes. But when all seemed lost, the radio around the creature's neck started to emit the sound of static before cutting it a familiar voice. His master's doctor spoke through the radio. He had introduced the beast, its name apparently being Gigantomachia, which possesses multiple quirks and was formerly Sensei's bodyguard. Apparently, All for One had sent him into hiding after All Might had originally injured him. The beast said it wanted to accept him, but said he was just far too weak. Dabi, who had arrived late, wasn't too pleased about this, however, claiming that the so-called gift wasn't a good one. The doctor agreed, saying that it was too loyal to All for One at the moment. Dabi unleashed a torrent of flames against the beast, but it merely shrugged it off, and before it could retaliate the doctor played a recording of All for One's voice to calm it down. "I don't want him," Tamura stated staring ahead, up at the beast. "Grow up," the doctor stated harshly, through the radio. "You spent too much time with Kurogiri. You cannot get everything you want." Following that short exchange, the same warping quirk that All for One used at Kamino was used to bring them to the doctor's personal lab, all except Gigantomachia. Upon arrival, everyone took the liberty of looking around. Dabi noticed around a dozen Nomu in development, notably much different than the normal ones. The doctor, in response to Dabi's inquiry, labeled them as high-end Nomu, saying that they are much more advanced than the old ones. He introduced himself to everyone, using an admitted alias known as Daruma Ujiko. He told Tamura, very bluntly, that he would have to prove he could pass on his master's will, before giving him the condition of making Gigantamakia submit to his will. The doctor told Dabi that he could stay back with him to help test out the high-end Nomus, since he didn't want to go with the group. Then began a seemingly impossible fight between the League of Villains and Gigantamakia. After the festival, Izuku and his new sister Izumi, previously named Eri, were hard at work. For the following month or so, they worked endlessly on their respective things. They had a lot to do up to when the hero rankings were to be announced. Izuku had to stop making the scorpion suit for around a week so he could make an automatic drone assembly machine. He didn't know exactly what to call it, so he just went with the ADAM. The ADAM had come along easier than he actually initially expected. He had previously completed the blueprints for it when he had free time at night, so all he really needed to do was build it. It took a little less than a week of endless work. It was just in the nick of time too, since he was going to be meeting the new member of his team then too. It's not to say he didn't have his difficulties with it, but ultimately it was completed in an optimal timeframe. The thing was long. He meant long. He had to build it on one of his sub-level floors because it just took up that much space which, luckily, the warehouse had plenty of on other levels. He had to make an AI specifically for the machine too, giving it instruction on how to do certain things and in what order to do them. The assembly line stretched from one end of the large room to the other in length, but in width it was pretty tame. In fact, he was considering building at least 2 more in the same room and then making a transport system leading to somewhere else in which the drones can be stored. The initial tests were actually a success, and the drones that were built were basically replicas of his already existing drones. It took some time for it to build, though, estimating at around 5 hours or so. Izuku didn't much care, though, knowing that time could definitely be improved, especially if he built more ADAMs. During the time he was busy with that, he trusted Izumi to complete her schoolwork without his constant supervision. In fact, she did, but she went even further beyond that. She, to his utter shock, had ended up testing out of her middle school courses. He was elated and proud to see her doing so well. So much so that he decided to nickname her his little prodigy. She hated it. Soon enough, the day of his meeting came. Izumi, despite wanting to come, had to stay at home. He told her to continue her work. She was unhappy about it, but relented anyway. Izuku and his new team member had been in contact a few times after their initial conversation, but only about specific details about what would be brought to the meeting and whatnot. He arrived at the mall's food court area at the exact time he had mentioned beforehand. He looked around the semi-busy mall and found who had been looking for. A man in a dark blue hood sitting alone in the corner of the area. Izuku approached the table, which only had 2 chairs, and sat in the only other open chair. The one across from him was surprised, at first, but seemed to recollect himself quickly. The two sat in silence for a while with Izuku even developing a sort of smirk when he noticed the other's expression. What's wrong? Surprised. He looked away, a little nervous, it seemed. For someone with such a reputation, you're young. That's what's wrong, Izuku shrugged. It doesn't matter to me, really, don't worry about it. The other raised a brow. You're not afraid I'll tell the league or something? Izuku chuckled. I trust you not to tell them. Your personality doesn't really fit that kind of thing, in my opinion. Plus, he used the same trick he did on Gentle, changing his appearance to look like a random person before changing back. You never really truly know what I look like. The other one chuckled. I suppose not. Well played. Silence ensued for a few moments before Izuku decided to speak again. I know you said you didn't really care all that much for it, but you know my ideals and end goal, but not exactly how I'm going to do it. I thought I should fill you in, do you agree? He shrugged. I'm not going to lie, I'm interested. I'll probably still be down for this even if the method is questionable, though. The league is starting to piss me off. I regret joining that garbage pile. He shook his head, disappointed in himself. You're more of the idealist I want to follow, anyway. Shoot your plan at me. He crossed his arms, awaiting his new leader to start talking. Izuku did, for a while. He went into serious depth as to how he had grown to be the way he was and how he would like to achieve his end goal. I know that this is terrible, I hate it too, but publicity will be necessary if I want to make an influence. He shrugged. Yeah, I hate that stuff. You've already hashed this and support this opinion, but publicity isn't what should make a hero. But I do have to agree that a high publicity will be necessary to make a change in this kind of society. Izuku nodded. I'm still working on ways to incorporate myself into the hero spotlight. Something that'll bring me great attention and show that I'm legit while downplaying most other heroes. He gave Izuku a questioning look. What about hero registration and all that jazz? I've got my files and stuff settled. Everything should be in order regarding my hero license and background. He gave a sly smile. They won't even notice the difference between the fake and a real one. He raised another brow. How do you end up managing that? He questioned a bit skeptically. They could do some research and ask the school you listed what's up, right? How are you gonna handle that? Izuku's sly smile never faltered. There's a hero school in the country that's founder, and most of the staff are quirkless. They sympathized with my ideals and were willing to support me. He shrugged. Of course, I gave them some money in compensation as well. He looked at the other, about to add more. There are also people in the hero administration itself that agree with my ideals and methods who also want a change. A real change. I've got a lot of people backing me in pretty high places, so if people start asking questions things will be proven legit. Let's not even mention the people in the police. There are, believe it or not, a lot of sympathizers out there in a multitude of places. Why go through all of this trouble, then? He asked, looking at him questioningly. If you've got people in the higher up part of the hero administration, why don't you just have them institute a change? Because they can't. Izuku responded to the question, not really minding it. People need proof, solid evidence that the current system and heroes are flawed. That's essentially my job. A popular hero to influence the masses and a villain to expose the fakes. Both are necessary. Ah, he nodded in some understanding. He seemed to accept the answer he got, now choosing to talk about other matters. You told me you were scouting for some people before. He brought up, getting Izuku's attention. Who do you have in mind? Well, one of them is actually quite young. Izuku admitted, which surprised him again, but again he recomposes himself quickly. He's going to be at UA in a little while as well, so I'm planning on taking that time to introduce myself to him. His eyes widened. You're a UA student? Izuku chuckled softly. Hell no, that dream was crushed a while ago. He admitted, a tad grimly, but he got over it quickly to continue what he wanted to say. The point is that he'll be away from his usual spot. More in the open, if you will. I may not be able to get into UA, but I can get him out. He rose a brow, clearly contemplating exactly how he planned to do that, but he didn't say anything. It seemed like he just accepted what Izuku said. Izuku wasn't sure if that was because of his reputation or that he just expected Izuku to be capable of such a feat. Speaking of UA, Izuku spoke again, getting his new ally's attention. I would like to know who the spy is. I've been doing my best at trying to figure it out, but he or she must be an incredible actor. He smirked. So you do know about them? Izuku also smirked. So there's more than one? Interesting. He only nodded, bending down to his side where he apparently had a bag of some sort, and grabbed some stuff out of it. He slid it across the table to Izuku, who grabbed it and started to read. They were mostly papers he had seemingly written himself, which consisted almost entirely of notes and images. That stuff has most of the stuff you're probably looking for, including information about the League members, associates, and spies. He spoke, pointing at particular papers. Izuku flipped through and skimmed some of them. He found some interesting pieces of information. These two are interesting indeed. I'll have to go say hi to them soon. Izuku was genuinely interested in what he was reading about the spies. They were interesting characters, that was for sure. Their backstories were indeed something he found to be intriguing. They could be swayed to his side if he played his cards right. From what he knows now, the police and school are doing an active investigation to determine who their spy is. He would have to act quickly with them. Something caught his attention on another page. Gigantomachia? The one across from his nodded, something that serves as All for One's previous bodyguard. Izuku raised a brow, lowering the page he had in his hand to look at the speaker. The thing, from what the doctor has let slip, has multiple quirks. It tanked one of my strongest attacks without even flinching. Currently the League is trying to make it submit to them. I chose not to go. Izuku hummed thoughtfully. Either way, if the League gets it on their side or not, it needs to be eliminated. He commented darkly, his eyes beginning to narrow on the page about it. Something like that shouldn't be running around. He nodded. I agree. Any ideas on how to take it down? Izuku looked up at him. Maybe. He thought for a moment, considering a plethora of ideas. Do you think that it's vulnerable to any form of penetration on his skin? Lethal injection? Maybe? Perhaps a sort of toxin or poison? The other also hummed and thought, possibly. Like I said, we basically couldn't do a thing to it when we initially fought it. Its skin is almost impenetrable, but maybe through the eyes, ears, nose or mouth those things can work. The thing likes to hang its mouth open a lot. Depends on what you can do. The thing is really stupid, so I'm sure you can get away with anything on the first attempt if you tried it. Izuku shrugged. I may be able to figure something out. I'll take this as a priority threat and try to find a way to permanently eliminate him. Oh, also, Izuku started to change the subject. I'm not sure if you're aware yet, but the Meta Liberation Army has been starting to make moves again. Destro's autobiography was recently released and is actually selling quite well. The one across from him nodded. I've heard about that. People around the country are starting to support the Army's ideals. It was Izuku's turn to nod. From my sources, I've heard that they're viewing the League as a prominent threat. Someone on the forums, most likely an Army loyalist, Said something about the league overshadowing them, or something. I'm afraid they'll start moving on them. They will, I'm sure of it as well. The one across from him commented, admittedly a little nervous. If they are, I'm not really looking forward to it. I've heard that the resources they have are no joke. Izuku shook his head. You're right. Do you know Yatsubashi Rikia? The other raised an eyebrow again. The president and CEO of the Detenirot Company? The fairly well-known lifestyle support company? He questioned, making sure he had heard right. When Izuku nodded, he continued talking. Yeah, I've heard of him. The guy's a pretty big deal. Well, what if I told you that he's the Grand Commander of the Meta Liberation Army? His eyes widened. You can't be serious. The guy actually seems really genuine about making the world better for people with difficult quirks. He is, to a certain extent, Izuku responded, but all that is just the public facade. Behind the scenes he's running one of the most dangerous organizations on the planet with thousands of soldiers ready to pounce on command. Izuku looked up at the hooded person across from him, his face mixing into one of curiosity and wonderment. His father is the original Destro, with him taking the place as the new leader with the name Re-Destro. I'm not even going to question how you know this, since I'm sure you have your sources, but this sounds exceptionally bad, the hooded person commented. With the resources he has, I wouldn't be surprised if he had everyone in satellite or something. Izuku nodded, he most likely does. This is a big reason as to why they need to be taken care of, either through elimination, merging with them, or just plain making peace with them. Those last two options sound a bit out there. He crossed his arms. How do you think you'll manage accomplishing either of them? Izuku looked at him. The Meta Liberation Army's ideals are interesting. They aren't exactly the same as ours, but similar enough to where we can potentially work with one another. Izuku smirked, catching the other off guard. However, if they don't see reason and don't listen, then I have some ideas on how to deal with them. Izuku received a questioning gaze. Mind sharing? He shook his head, crossing his arms and leaning back into his seat while grabbing a whole new paper to read. Admittedly, I'm still a little unsure about a lot of stuff regarding them. It really depends on the final team I put together and what they ultimately listen to. Our first priority should be to make sure that Re-Destro doesn't attempt to face the League. When the other nodded in understanding, Izuku proceeded to read the sheet of paper he had taken. Silence ensued as he read. The whole page, front and back, was dedicated to one specific subject. High-end Nomu? He questioned, continuing to read. At least a dozen, a few ready, these are bad. The one across from him nodded, incredibly strong, multiple quirks, all of that jazz. He crossed his arms, looking at Izuku with a narrowed look. I'm not sure how the doc's able to give them multiple quirks with all for one in the slammer, but he's doing it, planning to make more too. Izuku figured that, with all for one gone and the fact that the Nomu were still being made, meant that they had some kind of way to duplicate quirks. Izuku looked at him seriously, reaching into his own bag and pulling out a handful of things. I was planning on giving these to you anyway, but now seems to be a better time. Hold out your hands. He held out his hands, allowing Izuku to drop separate things into each hand. The other looked at what had been dropped in his hands. There were multiple small objects in both hands, and though they looked similar, had their little differences. The ones in his left hand had a dark red circle in the middle, while the other ones had a different design. What are these? The ones in your left hand are nano-explosives. Upon receiving the answer to his question, a small ounce of panic made itself known on his face. Relax, they won't explode. The material they're made of is extremely durable, they can take a beating. Don't underestimate the explosion, though. When the other nodded, Izuku continued. The ones in your right hand are bugs used by me to gather information. If you place a few of those around, maybe on Shigaraki himself as well as the doctor, I'll be able to record their conversations as well as listen in whenever I want, not to mention track them. You should place at least one in the lab though, I would like that on my radar and to be able to hack into the system there at any time. I get the bugs, but why the explosives? He asked, a little confused. There are a lot more of them too. I gave you more than what I originally wanted to give you, Izuku admitted, his face more serious. However, with these high-end Nomu, I think I'd be best to plant some of these on their weak points, just in case. I see. Well, it shouldn't be a problem. He looked at the bugs and explosives in his hands before separating them using two different pouches in his own bag. After he did that, he looked back at Izuku with a questioning look. I assume that, just maybe, you want me to put some around the key points of the lab too? Izuku chuckled. If you have some left over, then yeah. If not, then it's no big deal. I'm sure they have it running on some kind of system, so if I hack into it I could mess it up. Izuku also gave him a curious look. How'd you get permission to leave, anyway? He gestured to the bag he had with him. I'm supposed to be on a supply run. He wants some basic necessities, food and the like. He looked back at Izuku with an annoyed expression. The man doesn't want to move. He's too distracted in his work, so he's having me do his errands. One of the high ends has a warping quirk that he uses to transport me to places and back. Izuku had another question. You said these high ends have higher intelligence than the previous ones. Are you able to give it commands? He nodded. Yeah, they'll listen to me. I was actually planning on. His eyes widened a bit, before smirking. Izuku became curious as he spoke again. I actually have an idea. Izuku motioned him to continue, his curiosity piqued. I had originally been planning on using one of the high ends, Hood, he's on the paper somewhere, to attack Endeavor the day after the Hero Billboard chart event. Izuku raised an eyebrow at that. He had already been planning on using this high end, so the fact that he suddenly figured it could be used to his advantage was intriguing. Izuku thought about what his teammate had in mind, and as he thought about it more he actually thought he had some clue as to what this idea was. After a moment of silence, he continued, what I'm thinking is this. I still send the high end. But, you, with your fake hero persona, could swoop in to save the day. I can still plant the nano-explosive in its head, if all else fails, and it'll be destroyed that way. Izuku smirked. What an idea indeed. I'm impressed with that plan of yours, though I'm surprised you're veering off of your original plan of killing Endeavor for this, considering your opinions of him. He chuckled, with the way you sound things, almost likely have another opportunity to take care of that bastard. He looked at Izuku knowingly, leaning back in his seat similarly to Izuku. Knowledge is power to you. I'd be a fool not to recognize that. You probably got plan after plan, backup plan after backup plan. Let's not even mention the fact you know almost everything about anyone that interests you, he chuckled, like me. You're not wrong, Izuku responded, genuinely impressed at his new teammate's view on things. I'm glad to know you recognize that. Izuku looked at him, curiously. I like that plan, but I've got something just a smidge better. Want to hear it? When Izuku received a nod, he continued, let's move the attack to the day of the Hero Billboard chart event. His eyes widened in surprise. Wouldn't that be a foolish idea, though? He was genuinely confused. They just had dialogue about how smart he was, so why did he just suggest this? There are going to be hundreds of heroes in attendance, on guard, or nearby. It would get decimated. Izuku held up a finger, looking at the section where the particular high end is listed on one of the papers. This high end you wanted to send, Hood, has a multitude of different quirks. Muscle augmentation, super regeneration, shoulder-mounted jets, transforming arms, power, and finally, storage. This particular one is incredibly powerful. It's made to be a tank in battle. He looked up to his teammate. The heroes in attendance are going to be too crowded with each other. Not enough room to work and use their quirks without risking another's life, especially in Endeavor's case. That'll put them into a bad position, in which then I'll save them. He looked at Izuku with eyes full of something similar to admiration. Not bad. Though I have to ask, won't this cause a lot of deaths? More pro-heroes than civilians, granted, but deaths nonetheless. You good with that? I don't want the initial attack to last that long, maybe a few minutes but nothing much more. Izuku closes his eyes. It's regrettable, but there likely will have to be some deaths. He looked at his teammate, a determined look in his eyes. I made a commitment a while back to fulfill my goal but any means necessary. This applies to that. After a moment of silence, he spoke, I get it, it's necessary. He glared down at the table, hands becoming angry fists. I'm still pissed at the fact I actually went along with the League. I should have known from the moment we met that they didn't represent the ideology I follow. He looked at Izuku, matching his determined eyes. I went along with the attack they did on the students. Students that haven't even proven their heroics yet. He wanted a few kids kidnapped to torture them for foiling his last attack, having nothing to do with true heroism. I regret that. Izuku genuinely smiled at the little rant. That's what makes you a great teammate. Izuku's smile flipped into a frown. I did do some digging into your past, admittedly, and I know what drives you. You're a reliable team member that genuinely believes in the cause. To Izuku's milk surprise, his teammate didn't seem annoyed, angered, or anything when he said he had looked into his past. He seemed to notice Izuku's mildly confused expression, so he spoke, if you're wondering why I'm not mad about you looking into my past, well, there's a few reasons. He leaned forward, looking at Izuku and putting his arms on the table. I expected something like this. You're a well-known broker, known for your information gathering and analysis skills. How could I not expect you to look into me? Izuku nodded, once again impressed. Fair point. Izuku then grabbed some files he had brought, handing them to his new teammate. If it's not too much trouble, do you mind maybe taking him out? Doesn't really matter how, or who really does it. The only condition I'm implementing is that he isn't killed. I only want him taken out of commission, perhaps through a kidnapping or injury. I'm not looking to kill him. He opened the file, looking down at the few papers it contained. Nighteye, huh? I can see how he'd be a problem. What about the other one? I don't remember his name. Lemillion, Izuku answered, looking straight at him with a narrowed look. Plan the attack for when Lemillion and Rule are not there. Once Nighteye is down, I'll deal with Lemillion personally. As for Rule, I'm still unsure. He nodded, understanding his objective. He put the files in his own bag before looking at Izuku and asking, "Want him gone in any specific timeframe or?" "Within a month would be ideal, so somewhere between now and 30 days. Izuku answered him. "Anything longer than that I feel is pushing our luck." He nodded, silence ensuing once again for another few moments before Izuku slid another piece of paper across the table. "What's this?" Izuku smirked. "A list of possible new aliases I've thought up. I thought that maybe you'd want to change from Dabi to something, I dunno, more intuitive?" The man now known as Dabi looked at Izuku dumbly. The name Dabi was intuitive. "Like what's this one? Molten Man? What kind of name is that?" Izuku laughed. "It's something small. Actually, you could use that one for later." Dabi raised an eyebrow. "What comes later that would require me to need another fake name?" "I'll have to inform you about that later," Izuku told him. "As much as you're trustworthy, the plan is subject to change due to potential unknown factors or possible failures. When the time comes, I'll inform you." Izuku paused, thinking about something. Once he had an idea as to what he wanted to say, he spoke to Dabi again. "Before we wrap this up, can you tell me a little about your quirk?" He seemed to be taken off guard by the question. Izuku clarified. "I know a little about it, but most of the specifics are unavailable. I can only get them straight from the source. This is going to be mainly for whether I need to make you any support equipment or not." Dabi hesitated for a moment, averting his eyes before answering the question. "My quirk allows me to generate a large amount of extremely hot blue flames." He looked back to Izuku. "My body has a low tolerance to them, though, so I can't use them for a prolonged period of time. The heat from the flame is hot enough to incinerate people in seconds, so just imagine how that is for me." He paused for a moment to take a breath. "If you want to talk about offense and defense, I'm able to use it in multiple ways. Offensively, I can create fireballs which I can launch at people, release a torrent of fire similar to a flamethrower and just normally release bursts of fire. Defensively, I can generate flame walls from the ground and burn away most things from hitting me." Izuku hummed, contemplating what he had been told. That was plenty of information. All he really needed to do was think of some support gear to help him. "Alright, thanks, that's more than enough information. I'll have to work on making you some gear to help reduce the risk of burning yourself and also perhaps increase the range of your attacks or reduce spread." As Dabi dumbly nodded in understanding, Izuku stood up while grabbing his bag, preparing to leave. Dabi looked at him with a wondering look, also standing up and grabbing his own bag. "I don't understand why you trust me so much already." Izuku gave him a small smile, putting a hand on his shoulder. "There are a lot of reasons as to why I'm putting a lot of trust into you." He removed the hand from Dabi's shoulder and held it out for him to shake. "It was good to meet you. I'm glad to have you on the team." Dabi just stared at the outstretched hand, a bit bewildered by the suggestion. It was almost as if it was too foreign to him, which Izuku could understand considering his past. After a moment of silent staring, Dabi reciprocated the handshake, actually giving Izuku a genuine smile. "Glad to be on the team, boss." With that, the two went their separate ways. Izuku knew he could trust Dabi being on his team, and Dabi would prove to be a valuable teammate. Things were definitely coming together now. Izuku really liked that. There were things he needed to prepare for and work on, and he would be lying if he said he wasn't nervous, but overall things were really starting to come together. Over the next 2 weeks, Izuku had his mind set on a few different things. He worked on the scorpion suit, which was actually progressing a lot quicker than he had initially anticipated, but he also had his mind set on a few other things. Things that, to him, he felt like would be more useful in the future. Mainly, he wanted to upgrade his suit. There were a few ideas floating around in his head, as well as on more than a few pieces of paper, regarding what he could actually add or change. One of the major things he wanted to do though, was add an interface similar to the one he had for the mocap suit into the actual suit. Essentially, when he fabricated the helmet, he wanted it to be the same interface as the illusion dome. That wasn't too hard to do, at least for him, so it wasn't at the top of the list. There were also other things he could add, like mini projectors. The purpose for them was for them to pop out of the back of his suit and strictly use them for emergencies, or if he didn't have access to any of his drones. These would also only be projectors, as well as some form of flight mechanic, nothing more. He thought of maybe adding 4 or 6 into his suit. The major thing he thought he needed though, was weaponry. Not the weaponry he had on his drones. No, he needed something else. He had given it a lot of thought, ultimately putting down a plethora of fully developed ideas in multiple notebooks, but in the end he just thought some of them wouldn't exactly work the way he wanted. He pushed away the ideas for the time being, but did want to come back to them later. Some of the ideas were still itching at the back of his head, so he couldn't just scrap them. That took around a day to decide. With nothing else to really do, he ended up devoting most of his time to the scorpion suit. Something that surprised him was that it was, as he had previously analyzed, was progressing a lot quicker than he had thought. The suit itself, from what he calculated, was around halfway done. This was mostly the armor and the necessary implements required to wear it. The interface and features wouldn't be added until later when the actual wearable suit was done. But, overall, he expected the actual suit to be done in a month or so. When he wasn't working on that, he made ideas, designed and started developing Dabi's support equipment. It wasn't much, but he had a few things ready. For one, he made a fireproof funnel which would attach to his arm and fold in and out depending on whether he wanted the spread to be large or small. He would have to get Dabi's personal opinion of it, but he was also considering designing and making him a new suit or outfit as well. There were other things he thought of but was ultimately unsure about as well. Dabi has also informed him that everything was in place. The nano-explosive had been planted on the high-end's weak spots and bugs have been planted throughout the lab. Izuku took the opportunity to find the location of the place. Imagine Izuku's surprise when the lab seemed to be right on top of Jaku General Hospital. He was, at first, confused as to why such a well-known and positive hospital seemed to be the location of the lab. Through his bugs, he had even been able to hack into the lab's systems and access the Nomu data, so he figured that the lab had been right under the hospital. But the question was, how? He had done more research into the hospital itself, only to find out that the place had been founded by a quirkless man named Garaki Kyudai. There were a lot of things he had found to be utter bullshit from that. For one, there was absolutely no possible way the man was quirkless. When Izuku did his research on the man, using very obscure sites and classified documents, he found pictures of him dating back 60 years, at least. Yet, he still looked the same. This meant that the man had some kind of immortality quirk. The next thing was that this man seemed very, very familiar to him. Izuku felt like he had seen him before when he was younger, so he had brought the topic up to his mother. Inko had been surprised to see the man's picture, immediately recognizing him as the same doctor that diagnosed him as quirkless. Izuku didn't quite know how to feel about that, but he did know that he would find a special enjoyment after eventually taking him down. After all of that, he decided that he should finally start training Izumi's quirk. Rewind was special in the sense that it only worked on organic beings, but it wasn't limited to just reversing things to a previous state. While it certainly could do that, Izuku couldn't undo but theorize that it could be capable of so much more than that. For example, immortality. It was a stretch, but oh so very possible. There were also questions he had, like would it work on dead cells, since they were previously living, or would it be null? After Izumi finished her work for the day, he had her test her quirk on some plants he had gotten. The goal was to see if she could do two things, actively turn her quirk on and off, and if she could control the rate at which she used rewind. There were also other things he planned to keep track of, like the range in which rewind could reach. Was it limited to touch or could it be extended based on motion? If he stood next to her while he used it, was he safe or could it branch to him? Could it work on a genetic level, or was it limited to just outside physical states? Additionally, he had a tranquilizer on standby if she ever went out of control. He had brought it up with her beforehand, just to make sure she was alright with it. She ultimately said she trusted him enough to use it on her if she went out of control, agreeing that he could use it. When she had come face to face with the plant, she had a scared look present on her face. Izuku, who had previously been sitting further back, went up to her and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Izumi, what's wrong? She turned back to look at him, a tear starting to form in her eyes. Izu, I'm scared. What if I hurt you? I don't want to lose you. Izuku frowned. He understood exactly why she was afraid. Chisaki had basically drilled the fact she was a curse into her head. She was afraid that by using her power, she would end up hurting him. Even with that tranquilizer nearby, she couldn't help but be afraid. He gave her a hug full of love and compassion for the girl he now called his sister. She had instinctively hugged him back, while he spoke, you don't have to worry about hurting me. You never do. He broke the hug, looking at her tearful eyes. You're not a curse, and you have a wonderful gift. Of course there will be some trial and error here and there, but we'll get through it. He had given her the most determined smile he could muster up, which seemed to help motivate her. She wiped her tears away, her face becoming more determined as she faced the plant again. She was focused and ready. Her horns started to grow and glow brightly. Izumi, feeling the energy surge within her, outstretched her hand and touched the plant in front of her. Immediately, the effects of her quirk began to take hold. The plant began to essentially rewind in time, slowly but surely going back to when it had just been a seed. Once the plant successfully transferred back into a seed, Izumi had stopped using her quirk on it. She attempted to deactivate it, but the more she tried the more it flared. She began to quickly panic, in which Izuku immediately took notice and tranquilized her before she could hurt herself. Once she was knocked out, her horn shrunk down and he caught her in his arms. He had a thoughtful look on his face as he looked at her. Rewind seemed to have a tie to her emotions, as seen when she activated it easily enough through her determined and focused state and when she panicked, causing it to flare up even more. Izuku would have to work on that with her and help her control her own emotions. That's what they ended up doing all the way up to the day of the Hero Billboard chart event. The two, once done with their respective work, engaged in quirk practice. Slowly but surely he taught Izumi how to handle her emotions, focus and harness them to help her maintain control of her power. She seemed to excel in practice. It took a little over a week, only leaving a few days left, but she eventually got the hang of her emotions enough to be able to activate and deactivate her quirk on command. The next thing to work on was her limit of control, such as proximity and speed. For the last few days up until the event, Izuku tried to get Izumi to practice both. She was able to get the handle on both things, albeit in a very limited sense. For one, she was able to, at least, somewhat slow down the rate at which the object was rewound. It wasn't by much, but it was a start. She was also able to section off her power to a singular part of her body, not her entire body. She was able to transfer the energy from her horn, which was essentially the source of her power, to her hand. Izumi, when Izuku had asked, described the feeling as a weird energy that came from her horn. When he asked her what she meant by energy, she had told him that she felt a strange fuel source flowing throughout her body. She said it was part of the reason she had initially had trouble deactivating it. Either way, they had made more progress than Izuku could have ever hoped for in just that short amount of time. The day before the actual event was spent resting in preparation for it. It would be a big and busy day, after all. He didn't want to mess this up. He had to ask Izumi to do something for him, though. There was a window of opportunity for one of his potential recruits and he needed someone to meet him and speak to him. He would not be able to fulfill this role due to the Hero Billboard chart event taking place that same day, so he needed to do other things. When he approached his sister about the task, she was initially hesitant. The main reason was that she was scared, something he had initially figured would end up being the case. She still wasn't entirely used to being without him yet, so being separated from him from such a hefty distance would surely have some kind of mental toll on her. He explained what he wanted her to do, in which she actually did start to ease up. He had given her a small remote, of sorts. He explained to her that if she pushed that button, he would be immediately alerted and he would drop everything to go and help her. It was the truth, too. He would most certainly do that if he had to. After he had told her that, she seemed a little too determined to do it. Izuku was worried at first and expressed his concerns, but she quickly redirected it somewhere else. He thought that perhaps she was afraid of disappointing him, or perhaps she didn't want him to sacrifice his goals for her again. Either way, no matter how many times he tried expressing his worries, she always told him it was fine and that she would do it. He couldn't help but feel bad about it, thinking he had somehow emotionally manipulated her, but had to let it go upon her insistence. The day had come, at last. He had quite a bit of work to do in order to make sure it went according to plan. Izumi Kota was being forced to tag along with the pussycats to the UA dormitories. It wasn't like he didn't want to go, in fact he was partially glad due to being able to see his hero again. She had risked her life to save his, so he naturally idolized her to a certain extent. She was a true hero, in his book. Regarding the 11-year-old's opinions regarding heroes and villains, that didn't really change. Of course, he understood why heroes existed and didn't absolutely detest them anymore, but he still hated some of them. True heroism was, seemingly, uncommon in a lot of heroes. Rule, the hero who had saved him, was a prime example of someone embodying true heroism. She was willing to sacrifice her own life to save his, who was a complete stranger to her. That was true heroism. He couldn't say the same about other heroes, though. Multiple news broadcasts that he had watched over the years had shown him that not all heroes embodied that trait. A sludge villain incident a while back ended with heroes being called out for their lack of action, which Kota couldn't help but agree with. Heroes that didn't act shouldn't be heroes at all and in his opinion should quit the job. Currently, he stood in the common area of 1A's dormitory. He was, admittedly, nervous. He was seeing the very same people he had previously shown hatred toward. Though, admittedly, it hadn't been that bad. Rule had come up to him and held his hands with a smile on her face. She seemed happy to see him, despite everything. She even noticed his hat changed to be more like the one she had with her hero costume. In a way, she looked touched by the gesture. He was glad she liked it, but was also embarrassed by the fact she saw it. As the attention drifted off of him and to the pussycats, he had started to get bored. They still had to go all the way to the other dorm and talk to those students too, not to mention going to the actual school to speak with the principal for some reason. They wouldn't be attending the ranking thing, which started very soon, anyway, so they weren't necessarily in too much of a rush. Kota asked if he could take a walk around the campus, mostly to exhaust his boredom and get some fresh air. He was allowed to, and he left on his own to aimlessly wander around campus with a bit of a brooding atmosphere. After a few minutes of walking, he had ended up in a more open part of the campus. He was completely alone, and he would be lying if he said he didn't feel slightly unnerved. Imagine his surprise when a holographic image, which started in blue and eventually colorized, appeared in front of him suddenly. He had let out a small yelp and ended up falling on his butt. It hurt a bit, but he hardly noticed due to the fact he was just staring at the image that suddenly appeared before him. It was a person, clearly, but it was just a black silhouette, nothing more, nothing less. The projection seemed to be emitting from an invisible, round thing in the air. A laugh escaped from the silhouette. I apologize if I startled you, that was not my intention. Kota was somewhat fearful of the person's form in front of him. He mustered up what little courage he had and stuttered, who are you? Why can't I see what you look like? The silhouette clearly turned to look down at him. My name and appearance will be revealed to you after certain conditions are met. I'm hiding my appearance here due to the small chance of someone walking in on this conversation, though the cameras cannot see me. Kota glared up at it, still fearful. What do you want then? It hummed, I want a few things. Particularly from you. He answered vaguely, making Kota a little confused. I've done some research on you, your past, present, personality, I know a lot about you, Izumi Kota. Kota froze at the mention of his name, which the mysterious person seemed to immediately take notice of. Ease yourself, I am not here to scare you. Rather, I am here to ask you some things. Can you answer some of my questions? Kota nodded to the figure in front of him. He had no idea what this person wanted from him, but Kota feared the worst. After what happened with Muscular, he couldn't help but be that way. I have a particular belief about heroes and villains in this world. From what I understand, you share similar beliefs to my own. It looked down at the boy once again. Tell me, Kota, what is your opinion on heroes and the society itself? Kota ignored how the figure called him by his first name in a show of finality and genuinely thought about how to answer the question he was given. Kota unconsciously eased himself as he thought, too, and eventually came up with a genuine response. I hate heroes that use their quirks for a show of power. The figure hummed, raising a hand motioning him to continue. I used to detest everything hero-related, but I know why they exist now. Heroes should be putting their lives on the line for people, not focusing on their popularity or pointless fights. Muscular, even though he was a villain, would be a perfect example of this. He was someone that just wanted to use their quirk for a good fight, to boost his image or just to pointlessly kill. In heroes things like that shouldn't be present. The figure hummed again, I see. Now, what if I told you that you can help change the world? Enforce those beliefs and help make heroes in the world better. What would you say to that? Kota looked at the figure questioningly, unsure as to what he meant. What do you mean? It was quick to respond, every day there are heroes, or that's what they claim to be, that let people either die or put them in danger. He raised his left hand, another colorful hologram appearing on that side. Kota looked at it, the hologram showed a recording of Endeavor fighting a low-level crook and a burning building. Endeavor is a prime example of this. This fight alone killed 103 civilians, all by Endeavor's own flame. By the hero that was supposed to be saving them. Kota's mouth went agape at that, while the figure raised his other hand with another hologram appearing on that side. Kota looked at that one, which played another recording of Death Arms and many other heroes standing idly by as a middle school kid was choking to death. Many heroes stand by, too cowardly to risk their lives to save innocent lives. The holograms disappeared, making Kota refocus on the main figure. That's what I aim to change. Kota looked at it, his gaze hesitated and his stomach twisting. He knew it was wrong of him to even consider this, but he couldn't help but agree with everything the figure had said. Kota then asked, How? How would you do it? The figure was silent for a moment, seemingly examining Kota's expression. The figure noticed his hesitance and spoke, Go to the UA gate, someone will be there for you to talk to. With that the figure disappeared, leaving Kota with his thoughts. He had to have been there silently considering everything he had been told for a while, but eventually he decided to lug himself to the gate. He didn't know why he decided to go there, it was more of a subconscious thing. Though, despite his own nervousness and fear he still felt obligated to go. It wasn't that he was being forced, but that he just genuinely wanted to go. Once he got to the gate, he walked out of the campus. He was confused at first, there had been nobody there. He had thought that it was some kind of prank, or perhaps he had been tricked, but after another minute he saw someone approaching. It was a girl, perhaps around his own age. They also seemed to be around the same height. She had shiny, semi-long blue hair and eyes with a smile that looked like it could reflect the sun. When she finally got to him, she kept the smile and spoke, "Kota, I presume." He dumbly nodded at her. He didn't necessarily know what to say, or ask. If he did ask something, would she even answer? Now he couldn't help but somewhat regret his decision. He had a choice to turn back before, but now he had to stick through it. "Come with me, please." She waved her hand toward her in a motion for him to follow. She started to walk away to a destination unknown. She didn't even look back to see if he was following, just walking. Kota started as she walked for a few moments before finally deciding to follow her. As they walked, with Kota behind the girl, he couldn't help but wonder who she was and what this was all about. He looked at her, curiously. "You're my age, right?" He paused, not saying anything else. He opted to wait and see if she responded first before asking anything else. She was quiet for a little while, but ended up shrugging. She saw no reason as to why she couldn't say this. He figured, "You're a year younger than me." She never once turned around to look at him, instead continuing to focus on where she was walking. Kota looked at her with a more curious expression. His initial fear began to subside after finding out her age, but he was still plenty nervous and confused about everything going on. "Then why are you involved with, whatever this stuff is?" She didn't answer that time. No matter how long he waited, she didn't answer. Eventually, after a few more minutes of walking, they made it to some kind of building. It looked abandoned, and Kota instinctively felt a little nervous about entering, but when the girl had fearlessly marched inside, he ended up following behind her anyway. They didn't go too far into the building, instead only traversing through a few rooms until they made it to a room with a televisions and some other furniture. Beside the television lay a multitude of discs and files that Kota assumed would be for what they were going to do. The room they were in was basically a living room, just minus a few things. Kota looked at the girl even more curiously as she began fiddling with some of the equipment. Kota couldn't help himself and asked another question, "What are we even doing here?" She started silent as she messed with some stuff, specifically the television and a few of the discs. She switched on the television and popped a disc in, grabbing a few files in her hands as well. She turned to him, "My brother set this place up specifically for you." She went and sat down on an old chair, which was placed next to a sofa in the center of the room. "I dunno exactly how he knew you'd be at the school today, but he got this place just for this meeting specifically. As for what this all is," she paused, staring ahead at the television as it booted up, taking her time with her thoughts. "I'm supposed to talk to you about stuff. He doesn't want us watching the event, for reasons, so I'm just going to explain everything to you and whatnot." She paused again, thinking for a moment before speaking again. "Yeah, that's it. You'll see a bunch of stuff and learn the gist of everything." Kota opened his mouth to say something, but then just closed it since he didn't really have anything to say. What she told him pretty much answered his questions anyway. Instead, he chose to sit on the empty sofa and wait for the program to start. He took out his phone and messaged his cousin, Mandalay, that he would be out for a while longer. It was mainly to keep her from coming after him or worrying too much. She said it was fine. As a minute or two went by and she messed with the television some more, because for some reason the channel's cords were messed up, Kota's eyes ended up drifting to the girl. He couldn't help but wonder how someone only a year older than him was involved in this stuff. Granted, he was now too, in a way, but this was different. She herself didn't look like she really wanted to be there with him, either, so he could really only wonder. The smile she was giving him really must have been a facade, he thought. Somehow, his mind started to admire her looks. She was actually a very pretty girl, and he couldn't help but. Her eyes snapped over to look at him with a fierce glare. She had caught him staring at her, clearly, and he flinched under her gaze. "First of all, I'm never, and I mean never going to get into a relationship with someone. So quit ogling at me." Kota immediately looked away, a blush on his face. "Second of all, this isn't even my real appearance." Kota seemed surprised at that. She sighed, "Safety reasons, extra precaution. I'm sure you understand." Kota dumbly nodded, a little frightened by her sudden snappiness. He understood why she was that way. If he were a girl, he probably wouldn't want some guy staring at him like that either. He opted to just look the other way and avoid looking in her direction for the remainder of the wait. He understood why she was hiding her real appearance as well, so he didn't bother questioning it all too much. His willingness to trust her, as well as the other person, was actually fairly high, he noticed. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way they were. He couldn't sense any hostility or malicious intent from either of their voices, and the person he talked to before seemed genuine about his ideals and opinions. That was why he had initially started to ease up. Still though, he remained a little tense as the two sat in silence. Eventually, she got the thing to work. She sat back down in her seat and told him to watch and pay attention to what happens. Kota didn't know whether to be intrigued or nervous. In Camino Ward, a large stadium was getting packed and full of people. The first Billboard chart event since All Might had been driven to an early retirement in the Camino incident against All for One. Heroes and citizens alike piled into the stadium, all eager, some nervous and others shaking with anticipation with what was to come. Everyone knew how important this was for the future of Heroes. Before this particular event, Heroes didn't appear on stage. This time was different, and everyone wanted to be there. The stadium was being sold out by the minute and the crowd just wouldn't let up. The announcer for the event was next to a crew on the inside who had a camera, which was broadcasting the event live. She began to speak to the viewers both at home and in the stadium. People cheered and yelled as some of their favorite heroes were announced for the top 10. Starting with number 10, a hero who ended up dropping down one rank from number 9, is the Dragoon hero, Yukyu. The announcer cheerful unannounced. Yukyu sat up from her seat, a hand in the air as she walked toward the stage. She made some comment about not deserving it this time, but it went ignored by the general audience. At number 9, he went down too. He won't be defeated, though, we have the equipped hero, Yoroi Musha. He stood up as well, commenting that he was plenty satisfied with his ranking, nor did he care much. Number 8. You may know him from the Clean and Shiny commercial, the laundry hero, Wash. Wash seemingly popped out of his washing machine, waving his hands and yelling something out enthusiastically. At number 7 we have a huge leap, Kamui Woods. He's a promising hero whose growth just doesn't seem to stop. Kamui began to walk to the stage as well, his hand in the air as he commented on the fact he was honored to be picked. There was also side drama about whether he and MT Lady were in a relationship, but that was quickly dropped. Number 6. From the orthodox school of manliness, he reliably keeps his ranking. Shield hero, Crust. He already stood in stage, crying to himself and mumbling about wanting to see All Might in action a little more before his official retirement. At number 5 we have a bunny with a determined spirit. Rabbit hero, Mirko. She flicked her hair back, smirking in no general direction. Number 4 is the mysterious ninja that had a huge jump in cases resolved and approval rating, Ninja hero, Edgeshot. He held a ninja-like pose on the stage, telling Mirko to be quiet after she made a snarky comment. Before the top 3 started to get announced, the announcer started to speak to her audience. She mentioned that all heroes involved in the Camino incident have seen an increase in their approval ratings. Even though he's currently on hiatus, he's still taking the number 3 spot. Fiber hero, Best Jeanist. We're all waiting for him to return as soon as possible. People clapped and cheered for Best Jeanist's ranking. Number 2. He does things his own way, but he's incredibly fierce. Wing hero, Hawks. People cheered loudly for him, as the hero himself looked a tad bored as he stretched his limbs. He merely claimed it was an exaggeration, nothing more. And now, at number 1, she cut herself off as the lights in the stadium began to dim, a bright red light starting to make its way toward the stage. He's been the temporary number 1, but today, he's really, truly in the number 1 spot. He's waited a long time. Flame hero, Endeavor. All of the announced heroes were now on stage, sans Best Jeanist who wasn't present. Someone had come to the front of the stage to speak, a lady from the Hero Commission, people assumed. She told them that people still thought that they lacked an icon, so they wanted to present the next heroes so everyone can work toward a peaceful society with them. Then they started going around, one by one, asking for a comment from each of the heroes on stage. As the comments went by, with a confident warning from Mirko as well, Hawk started to get increasingly bored. He sighed, unable to stop fidgeting in his spot. Everyone was basically saying the same thing, and he was getting tired of it. Right when Edgeshot stopped speaking, Hawks made his move, who's gonna be happy listening to all of that. Stain. Despite the silence in the place, one particular person couldn't help but imagine Stain foaming at the mouth out of pure happiness from what everyone was saying. Some of the heroes and civilians present, though, had mixed reactions. Mirko smirked in his direction, exclaiming that she liked him due to his cheekiness. Edgeshot expressed his own discomfort at the interruption in his unique way as well. Hawks gave off a few words in reply before walking up to the lady, taking the mic, and starting to speak. Let's see, his wings started to extend up behind him, levitating him into the air as he spoke. If we're just talking about approval ratings, Best Jeanist is number 1 with the boost he just got from being on hiatus. Second is me, third is Edgeshot, fourth Endeavor, I'll skip the rest. By now everyone had their eyes on him, Endeavor's standing out as a hard glare. I think approval rating is the most important number right now, though. Is this really the time to be dragging out the past? You don't think we need to change how we do things? The symbol is gone. At this critical juncture, why are those less accomplished than me playing it safe? Say something that sounds more hero-like. People amongst the crowd began to mutter and whisper amongst themselves. Clearly this was generating a mixed reaction from almost everyone. People commented on how they had previously seen him scowling, or how they couldn't tell what the winged hero was thinking. Hawks, only 22 years old currently, started an agency at 18 and had made it into the top 10 in the second half of that year. In the last ranking, he made it to the top 3. He was the first person in history to make it to the top 10 before the age of 20. People say it was too fast, over him being the fastest and youngest. People, as of now, don't know whether his behavior is due to his arrogance or just his way of doing things. That's all from me, Hawks commented, shooting downward from where he previously hovered. He moved next to Endeavor, handing off the mic to him with a cocky smile. Now, go ahead, number 1 hero with a lower approval rating than me. Endeavor snatched the mic from Hawks' hands, shooting him a cold glare. The two made eye contact, as Hawks slightly shifted his head upright. People anticipated what Endeavor would follow up with, believing it to be difficult for him to do due to the fact people could understand what Hawks said. Endeavor held the microphone up to his mouth, taking a deep breath before speaking. After a moment, he spoke, "Just watch me." Those 3 words left the entire place in a stunned silence. Nobody said anything, nor did anyone applaud. Actually, no, Hawks applauded him with a smile on his face. "Just watch you." Immediately, upon the sound of an unfamiliar voice echoing throughout the stadium, all heroes went on edge. All of them formed defensive positions, others went to keep the civilians from trampling one another. There was a bit of little panic amongst them, but the mass quantity of heroes present made it subside fairly quickly. To me that's a load of utter bullshit. The massive screen behind the stage began to static, changing from the logo that had previously been on screen to a shadowy figure. Its voice seemed to be modified into a deeper tone by some voice modifier. It seemed to be moving in real time, just his features were blocked out by some kind of shadow overlay. "Who the hell are you?" Endeavor shouted at the screen. Everyone's attention had been drawn to that now. The shadowy man looked to be actually glaring at Endeavor, but recomposed himself and sat straight. "Who I am isn't important," the deep voice insisted. Many people glared at the screen. "What matters is all of you. This is your event, after all. You're with the league, then?" Yukio questioned, fairly calmly as a matter of fact. Some of the other heroes nodded to show that they were in agreement with the question. Mirko developed a cocky smirk, pointing up at the screen. "Yeah, maybe you should just show yourself so I can send you flying." A few people were uneasy about her threat, thinking it may not have been the best idea. The shadowy man hummed irritatingly, "Don't lump me in with those fools." He waved a hand dismissively, also ignoring Mirko's little threat. "They're running around without a proper goal. They're just another set of criminals set on making a name for themselves. We don't align." "Then what do you follow, then?" Hawks seemed bored. His hands were tucked neatly in his pockets as he floated upward, most likely so the person on the screen would focus more on him. "You say you're not with the league, so you just stand for something. Right. To me, you're just another criminal. What makes you stand out?" Endeavor looked Hawks at with a cautious gaze as the person on the screen let out a humph, seemingly impressed at the jab. "Your hero system is flawed. My goal is to reform the system." Those simple words left most people watching speechless, unsure what to think. "So you're a stain worshipper, huh?" Hawks inquired, making some of the people a little more scared at the comparison. "If you surrender now I'll see if I can get you 2 adjacent cells in Tartarus." The figure laughed, clearly amused at Hawks' cheeky comebacks, "Though we strive for the similar things our methods greatly differ." He paused, letting that sink in. "I do not worship Stain, no, but I do have it out for many of you, hero fakes." A lot of people, heroes in particular, began to get greatly offended by the implied insult. Before anyone could let out their outburst, he spoke again. "I know a lot about most of you. A lot of you have done some questionable things during your times as a hero." He paused, taking the time to let out an amused laugh. He was going to enjoy this part. "Did you all know that Endeavor abused his family? Now you want him to be the number 1 hero. Ha." A lot of people present looked at Endeavor, who now sported a look mixed of both shock and unyielding rage. He looked like he was only a few seconds away from hurling fireballs at the screen. Hawks looked at Endeavor with a neutral expression, unsure as to what to think or even say. Seeing as nobody was going to speak again after such an accusation had been made, the shadowy man decided to talk again. "I recommend you people look into that a little more. Maybe ask his wife, he's the whole reason her mental health deteriorated." He paused, preparing himself for his next piece of evidence. Still in Endeavor. "Did you know he has the highest kill count in hero history? That's a big deal. Not to mention the amount of property damage he inflicts every time he deals with a simple thug." He seemed to glare, specifically at Hawks. "You say approval ratings are the most important. Well, when people approve of something like that, it causes a problem. What's more important is that heroes should actually do their job. You heroes get away with far too much. Hawks glared back up at the screen, seemingly ready to speak again. We do our job to the best of our abilities. At least, I do. Many of us here do. Blatant accusations like that will get you nowhere. Oh, Hawks, you're right. He responded to Hawks immediately, which actually took him back a bit. I'll be honest, you are one of the heroes I respect the most. Your work is efficient and you do what has to be done. For others, however, the screen began to change into something else. A video recording of the sludge villain incident which occurred over a year ago. It specifically showed heroes such as Death Arms, MT. Lady, and a few other minor heroes standing around as the villain choked out the kid in its grasp. This incident acts as a really good example. The heroes here, instead of actively acting to try and save the life of an innocent kid, just stood around and, I quote, waited for someone with a suitable quirk to show up. That kid would have died if All Might hadn't shown up. What would you be saying then? Quirks aren't everything, you know. Silence ensured as everyone genuinely considered his words. A lot of people ended up actually agreeing with what he said, while a lot of others considered it to be slander. There would definitely be controversy after this. Oh, here's another one. The screen changed again, showing a burning building. The footage playing showed how heroes, once again, stood around and did nothing while a normal civilian did their job. Oh, look at that, Death Arms again. But anyway, this is disgraceful. You stood by, again, and let a civilian do your job. The screen changed back to the shadowy figure as he spoke again. There are more examples, but those should be enough for now. I'll be sure to get a lot of evidence out to the police and administration. People glared at Death Arms, who shrunk under the intense pressure. Other heroes like MT. Lady were also being glared at, which some of them simply couldn't handle. Yukio spoke up again, trying to change the subject and alleviate the pressure from her colleagues. She was admittedly a tad fearful about what she was about to ask. You said easily that you know a lot about us. Are you the information broker that's been selling information to villains? She paused, letting the question sink in. A lot of other people voiced their opinions on the matter as well, agreeing with the question itself. She then hesitated to ask the next part. Were you the one that killed Overhaul that day? The figure was silent for a moment, before chuckling to himself. A lot of people were taken off guard by that, but remained vigilant. An astute observation, Dragon Hero, although it was a bit of a stretch. He took a breath, recovering from his mass onslaught of the chuckles. Yeah, I'm him, what of it? A lot of the heroes let out gasps of shock, mainly the ones that had been present during the raid. Yukio glared up at him. He didn't directly answer the second question, but she somehow knew that he did. She could feel the pit in her stomach grow as this went on. Endeavor growled angrily, his flames glaring up to dangerous levels as he began yelling at the Shadow Man, "You bastard, what did you do with the girl?" The Shadow Man on-screen seemed to once again glare at Endeavor. What, didn't have enough of abusing your own kids so you want another? Didn't what happened with Toya teach you enough of a lesson? After that comment, Endeavor froze and the entire place erupted into an onslaught of yells and shouts directed at each other and the Shadow Man. Heroes blamed one another, and citizens present began berating a lot them. Endeavor was receiving a good blunt of the shouts, mainly from citizens, enraged that their soon-to-be number one hero had been a domestic abuser. Enough. Hawks roared, feathers from his wings rushing out in a flurry to grab everyone's attention and stop the infighting. It worked fairly well, with a lot of people refocusing on the screen and quieting down. If the feathers hadn't gotten their attention, other people were quick to intervene and refocus everyone's attention. Once the place was quiet again, Hawks recalled his feathers and glared up at the screen. You say that many heroes here fail to do their jobs. That may be true, but people can change. He glanced at Endeavor from the corner of his eye. You're overlooking most of the good heroes, as well as the good all heroes in general do, and are focusing too much on the bad of it all. Heroes, even the ones you're saying are bad, have saved many lives over the course of their careers. The shadow figure didn't respond right away, taking his time to formulate a proper statement. You know, Hawks, I used to think people could change too, I really did, the Shadow Man said. But after getting bullied for years by the same person, I learned that not all people are created equal. He paused, letting that sink in. Would you like to know what happened to him, after he abused me for years and while I rotted away in my sorrow? Silence ensured. Nobody spoke in response to his question. He spoke again. After nobody said anything for about a minute, he got to attend the best hero school, not a scratch on his record. If people like that are allowed to become heroes, then the system is flawed. A lot of people were now also questioning their current hero system, if what he said was true. Hawks too, even started to question it. He would be doing his own investigation into the backgrounds of many heroes, after this. Nobody said anything to the man on the screen, though, which gave him the opportunity to speak again. However, that got people's attention. A lot of people snapped their heads up at the screen, after previously looking away to converse and share opinions with others. If you are so sure you heroes can change, I will give you one chance. One single opportunity to prove me wrong. A lot of the heroes gulped and a lot of the citizens began to cower. They could feel something coming. Someone big, something dangerous. Hawks looked uneasy. What do you mean? The Shadow Man didn't answer right away, but when he did, a lot of the heroes froze and tensed. His voice seemed sharper and somehow even deeper than the modifier was initially making it. You are about to be attacked. A lot of heroes stood up and assumed defensive positions, forming circles around one another and beginning to try and calm a lot of the startled citizens. If you prove me wrong, and show me that you heroes are capable of changing, then I will cease all of my activity. Heroes that were standing by defensively, even Hawks and a few heroes on stage, looked at the screen with a look of shock. I shouldn't have to tell you what to do. So prove it, heroes. Then the screen completely shut off, the screen turning back. Civilians began to panic and attempt to flee to the exit, trying their best to get out of harm's way before anything happened. Heroes were trying their best to evacuate people before this mysterious threat came. Hawks did his best as well, landing on the ground and using his wings to sense people who were in difficult spots or about to be trampled. He used them to effectively snatch them and move them to another, safer location. A majority of the heavier, more combat-suited heroes started to make a perimeter around the place. To them it was the best strategy. They were around most of the place, so if the attack came from any particular place, someone could hold it off long enough for reinforcements. After only a few minutes of preparation, the wall behind the screen, and in addition the screen itself, exploded inward after an intense force had rammed into it. A bit of dust flew in the air as the wall broke, but as it settled, almost everyone looking that way could see the black creature that emerged from the large hole in the wall. It was large, possessing a muscle build and a long neck. Its head was shrouded by a good of skin, leaving the muscles on its neck and shoulders exposed. It spoke in a stutter. Who, strongest? A Nomu. Many heroes were shocked by what the attacker was. The heroes immediately went to action, Yukio quickly transforming and others charging from all over the place to assist. Endeavor started to glow extremely brightly, centered trying his flame into his fist. Hawks yelled for him before he could throw the attack. Endeavor, you can't use that kind of firepower here. Endeavor stopped right before he launched the attack, glaring at Hawks as the winged hero attempted to get as many people out as possible. There are too many people in the building, and around. You'll risk injuring or even killing them. Endeavor considered his words for a few seconds before depowering his flame, making a TCH sound and moving a little closer to the fight. He would have to act as mild support, since he couldn't use his full power. He hated that. A fight was already starting to ensue, with Mirko making a fierce yet reckless jump and aiming a kick directly at the Nomu's head. The Nomu merely tilted its head down at an incredible speed, dodging the kick entirely. It quickly spun around, extending its arms and essentially slapping her away. Mirko flew away and straight into and through the wall, breaking it and sending her flying away. The Nomu hovered in the air, examining the other heroes that looked at it with caution and hostility. That all. Its arms extended as it began to rapidly spin, the jets on its shoulders flaring more as it did. The arms extended out further as it spun, delivering a devastating attack that knocked back a majority of the heroes out of the way and sliced clean through the building. The building's structural integrity was now extremely low, and due to a good portion of it getting sliced away from the attack, the top half of the building was beginning to collapse. More heroes that could see their uselessness in the fight began to rush to the citizens in an attempt to speed up the evacuation or save those that may be trapped. Yukio was one of the first people to recover, barely feeling damaged from the attack, and quickly started to press her own. She quickly attempted to grab the Nomu, but it was quick to use the jets on its shoulders to dodge. It sped up close to her and delivered a powerful blow to her stomach area, actually taking some of the wind out of her despite her resistance to blunt trauma. The Nomu then immediately pressed its other arm to her stomach and extended them out, pushing the dragon hero toward the crowd of people. Before Yukio could hit anyone, a stone-like hexagon shield was formed to stop her in her path. The shield hero, Crust, had been quick to act and use his shield, knowing she wouldn't be gravely injured from it, to prevent her from causing any harm to others. Wash started to form an intense, high-pressurized water pulse from the center door of his washing machine body and shooting it upward at the Nomu. It was quick to dodge the stream of water, maneuvering its way around it as Wash adjusted his aim and followed the Nomu's path. The Nomu smiled, seemingly enjoying this, and prepared to go in for an attack on Wash by closing its fist and reeling it back so it could stoke. Before it could, red streaks began to penetrate its body, freezing it in place. Wash seized the opportunity to get a direct hit on the attacking Nomu using his high-pressure water. The building, previously falling a slow place, began to start coming down with many people still inside. Yukio, after recovering, flew up to the roof, lifting it with her enhanced strength. She only had to keep it up long enough for everyone to get out safely, at least the civilians, though the roof was heavier than it looked and with the hit she just took it may take more effort than she thought to do the task. Mount. Lady as well actually tried to assist her with holding it up, which admittedly helped alleviate the pressure a lot. Hawks continued doing what he could, but he unfortunately wasn't able to save everyone from falling debris or from the spin attack earlier. Many civilians lost their lives. What irked him, too, was the fact that many pro-heroes, despite the villain's previous jabs, were still standing around being useless. Some of them just didn't know what to do with themselves, or just watched the fight and made no effort to assist. Others tried to help, especially with civilian evacuation, but a lot of them were ultimately getting in the way. Hawk's eyebrow twitched, but he kept his focus on helping civilians evacuate. The heroes in the fight assessed the situation more thoroughly. At first they thought they'd won, believing that Wash's high-pressure water completely erased his body. But, they were wrong. Someone was quick to call out the slow-falling head off to the side, making many heroes snap to look at it. The head, upon being noticed, was quick to regenerate itself back to its full body. Its arms extended out, aiming for both Wash and Edgeshot. The both tried to dodge, with Edgeshot using his quick to quickly evade the incoming attack. Wash, however, wasn't so lucky, being hit by the hand and quickly flung outside of the building. The Nomu landed on the ground, almost as if it was perching itself there. Boring. Aren't there any stronger heroes around? There weren't many heroes left that were willing or able to fight it, leaving Endeavor the only one standing on the field to take it. The Nomu looked at Endeavor, a chilling, satisfied smile making its way into its face. The Nomu, in an attempt to limit the interference of other, weaker heroes, began to eject many other Nomu from within itself. 9 other Nomu appeared and started to terrorize the still evacuating citizens and heroes. Before it could do anything else, Endeavor burst forward lunging at the Nomu with a fistful of fire. The Nomu dodged, hitting Endeavor in the stomach with its own powerful fist. Endeavor didn't give, though, grabbing the Nomu with his arms and using his flames to thrust himself into the air and through the wall of the building. Now being outside, Endeavor believed that he could more freely use his flames. He began to heat up, especially his fist. Prominence burn. He shouted, shooting a massive, concentrated beam of fire at the Nomu in an attempt to vaporize it. The beam was aimed horizontally, accidentally grazing a few of the distant buildings. Endeavor heard a rustle from behind him, so he quickly turned. The Nomu had once again thrown its head to save itself and quickly regenerated again. Endeavor was quick enough to dodge the extended arm, grabbing it with his own heated fist and spinning himself in an attempt to bring the Nomu closer. That didn't work, however, as the Nomu quickly used its wit to wrap the grabbed arm around Endeavor's body and then used that arm to launch Endeavor off into the far distance by performing a fast and powerful spin. Endeavor crashed through a building before he finally stopped. Luckily, it had been a smaller high-rise with not too many people, though he didn't even bother to consider that at the moment, too focused on the Nomu he was fighting. It started to zoom toward him at an incredible speed, intending to ram right into him. Endeavor had no time to dodge, getting hit by the Nomu head-on. Endeavor attempted to do the same strategy as before, but he was ultimately too slow and allowed the Nomu to use its arms to push him away. The hit knocked the wind out of him and caused him to helplessly fly through the air with little to no control. It was then Endeavor began to realize that this particular Nomu wasn't like the others. It was actively thinking, which made it even more dangerous. It was tactically thinking and making smart moves. He had to put it down before it could do any more harm. Though, before he could do anything more, another attack was incoming which he was still on the ground. Endeavor, despite his attempts to react quick enough, couldn't save himself from the Nomu's next attack. It sliced the left side of his face, most notably his eye. Endeavor began to fall from the sky, falling through the air at a rapid speed until he hit the ground with a devastating amount of force. The Nomu landed next to him, in the rubble of the destroyed section of places nearby. It seemed to be scouting for stronger foes, which couldn't be provided. Endeavor lay nearby, laying on his back on top of the rubble, bloodied, battered, beaten and unmoving. The Nomu shifted its head around, looking around eagerly for a strong opponent. Stronger heroes. After a little while of nothing, the Nomu has started to get increasingly bored. It used its shoulder-mounted jets to fly up into the air in search of humans. Once it did, however, a boom in the sky could be heard. The Nomu shifted its attention toward the sudden sound, pleasantly surprised to see green smoke trailing behind an approaching figure. The figure flew horizontally toward it, as the Nomu observed, a mystical-looking dome over where its head should be. The suit the person wore was unique as well, looking quite technical and fancy. Once the figure was within a reasonable range, it adjusted its stance to a vertical angle and opened the palms of its hands to reveal two green eyes in each, shrouded in a mystical glow, it seemed. The Nomu's smile only increased. He looked strong. Why you, strong? The Nomu received no response, but that didn't matter to it one bit. It rushed forward quickly, aiming to ram it as it did with endeavor. The mysterious hero quickly assumed a pencil dive formation and dove downward, avoiding the attack and retaliating with his own green beam from the left hand. The Nomu saw the attack coming, quickly dodging it and maneuvering around the following onslaught of green beams while somehow getting ever so closer to new hero. The Nomu, once it saw an optimal opening, launched itself forward at the mysterious hero. However, to its surprise, it flew straight through the hero. The Nomu spouted in confusion as the figure realigned their palm to face the Nomu. You'll have to try a little harder than that, the hero, now identified as a male with a bit of a muffled voice, said. The Nomu attempted to lunge at him again, only for the hero to swiftly dodge and once again let out a flurry of green beams. The Nomu easily dodged, preparing its arms to extend out and hit the hero that way. Once ready, it launched its arms forward and powered through the green beams of energy. However, to the Nomu's surprise, it felt nothing from the beams, even though they clearly hit his hands. The hero became intangible again, letting the arms pass through him and hit the empty ground. He flew up, shooting a green laser as fast as he could, which hit Nomu directly in the head. The laser, once it made contact, exploded into a bunch of thick green powder that obscured the Nomu's sight. The Nomu was confused at first. Was it supposed to feel something from that attack? It was about to move again, but the sudden loud beeping in its brain stopped it. Confusion again overrides any other considered action, as it hovered and pondered what the beeping was. The beeping got faster and higher pitched, and before the Nomu even knew it, the powder surrounding it suddenly shot toward its brain. Then, the next thing anyone knew, the Nomu's brain erupted in a large explosion that made the entire upper half of its body split into various little bits and pieces. Various parts of the Nomu, particularly its brain, skin, and muscle, began to rain from the sky, as the lifeless body fell to the ground and landed with a heavy thud. The hero landed to the ground near the bottom half of the body, seemingly ensuring that it was actually down for the count. Cheers began to erupt from nearby, most likely from citizens that were trying to evacuate and were able to witness the end of the fight. Many people approached him, asking for his name and who he was. A news crew nearby had been recording everything as well, even some in choppers above had been recording. A lot of other pros, as well as police, that had been outside assisting with the evacuation approached him to ID and question him. Some even grabbed his shoulders in pure shock or excitement over what had just occurred, but the new hero just shook them off. He pulled out his hero license, showing it to them to prove himself as a hero. Upon looking at it, they saw no problem with it. They were about to question him more, but the voice of the shadow man from before the attack spoke up from somewhere unknown. I'm not impressed. I'm beyond disappointed, and even outright furious. People were silent, everyone attempting to look for the source of the booming voice but to no avail. I hope you all understand my point now. All of these deaths could have been prevented had you all known how to properly handle the situation and act in a crisis. The time the lot of you incompetent heroes took just standing around waiting, not knowing what to do with yourselves, you could have saved an innocent life. I believe this proves enough, you hero pretenders. The voice then cut out, his message having been sent and definitely received by the entire populace. The damage had been done, though. The fight, and the attack itself, had been devastating in the end. Civilians and heroes alike still lay lifeless in the large stadium. Outside, many people were injured, possibly dead, and damage to buildings as well as property in general had been severe. Heroes try to recover who they can and rescue as many people as possible. Yuku and Mt. Lady had been able to get the roof out of the way long enough for most people to flee the stadium, but a lot of people weren't as lucky to make it out. They attempted to set the roof down in the empty portion of the stadium, but they couldn't control the extra falling debris and where they landed, however Crust did help a lot with that using his shield. From what it seemed, more pros died than civilians. It seemed that a lot of heroes that wanted to assist in the fight, or were just too close, ended up getting caught in the Nomu's attacks and didn't have the durability or strength to survive it. There were also a lot of heroes that passed trying to save civilians, only to get crushed by falling debris. Heroes like Kamui Woods attempted to do their best to get as many people out of the way as possible, which in the end saved many lives. A lot of citizens attempted to help in their own way as well, not just leaving it all up to the heroes. Some used their quirks or skills in certain fields to help evacuate, which was greatly appreciated. However, in the end, Hawks could only stare ahead at the carnage and destruction ahead of him with a dark look on his face. A video just ended, and Izumi couldn't help but groan as Kota gave her yet another uneasy glance. Please tell me you understand everything. I really don't want to sit through another video and go through another set of files just because you don't think there's enough proof. Izumi couldn't help but glare at the boy. They had been there for what felt like hours just doing this. She just wanted to go home. Izuku was probably done with his stuff now, and it was probably even getting dark outside. She was just tired. Kota seemed nervous, perhaps a bit scared, as he looked at her and responded, "Why yeah, I get it. I understand your ideals and stuff." Izumi gave him an odd glance, which Kota admittedly didn't know exactly what to make of. She seemed to be studying him, which made him uncomfortable. He knew that she was already a little cranky because he was too stubborn for his own good sometimes. He didn't want to believe most of the stuff, so he kept asking for more evidence, which made the girl want to throw him out of the window. In the end, she ended up easing up on him. "Alright, here," she handed him a special phone, which confused him. "I was told to give this to you. It's untraceable, so any calls on here won't be tracked or logged." She glared at him, making him gulp. "Don't think about giving this to anyone, either." He profusely nodded, showing he understood. She knew he wouldn't actually tell anyone, but she was a little snappy still and was just attempting to let off a little excess steam. Izumi then simply told him that someone, namely her brother, would be in touch about his final decision. To her, he seemed way too unsure and just plain nervous to consider trusting too much. She had been hard on him for some of those reasons as well, almost like a test to see how he'd act under pressure. After she watched him leave, probably back to UA where he was staying with the pussycats, she took her phone out of her pocket, dialing her brother's number. After a few seconds of ringing, he answered, "Hey, Izumi, how'd it go?" She shrugged, but after realizing he couldn't see it, she responded, "It went fine, I guess." She sighed. "Though I'm sure you already know, since you're watching." He let out a lighthearted chuckle. "Yeah, sorry about that. I was getting a little worried." She noticed a small change in his voice, which made her question, "Are you alright? Did everything go okay on your end?" He was silent for a few moments, making Izumi a tad more worried for her brother, I guess. He paused again, probably thinking about what to say next. "I don't really want to talk about it." She frowned. "Alright," she simply said, not wanting to bother him over something that was obviously upsetting him. She attempted to change the subject. "What do you think about him?" "Kota," she hummed in response. He didn't answer for a few moments, but eventually told her something that shocked her. "Actually, I was hoping to hear your opinion on him. What do you think?" Despite her shock at the prompt, she genuinely thought about it. After a minute of silence, she gave her opinion. "His sense of ideals are solid. I can see he genuinely believes in them. However, I don't think he has the will or resolve necessary for full membership." "I see," Izuku simply responded, not needing much more than that. He was easily able to put the pieces together like that. "I'll have to consider this a little more, then." I try to cover my explanations for everything in this chapter down below here. If you're looking for something specific, try skimming until you see it. If it's not here, you can leave a review to ask or DM me. In case you're wondering, yeah, Dabi was the one speaking on the screen while Izuku was on the scene in person using his Mysterio facade. Subtle details. He was saying stuff Mysterio would say, albeit with a bit of Dabi-ness sprinkled in, while doing things Dabi would to like glare at Endeavor. Yes, a lot of it was scripted. Izuku had a whole list of responses planned out, but Dabi had to improvise a bit too. Regarding how Dabi knew about what to say on the Bakugo bully stuff, Izuku had given that to him on his list of responses. Just because you didn't see him do this on screen doesn't mean he didn't do it. If you're wondering, why did he reveal himself now of all times? Well, it was just the perfect opportunity to do so. He wanted to send a message to everyone to really show how unreliable a lot of the heroes can be, and what better time to do it than when most heroes are gathered up with a bunch of citizens. Damage control and civilian lives are two major factors that need to be considered while fighting villains, which is actually what some of the heroes ended up failing to consider here. Izuku succeeded in what he sought to do, as well. People from here on out will begin to question the heroes that are supposed to protect them. I hope that made some sense. I can help clarify it a bit more if need be. There are also a lot of hidden factors at play, like the fact that he drew attention off of his hero persona by speaking again as the villain. People now know that those are two different people, with the person on screen not being a recording due to the fact he responded to statements. Mysterio and the villain are now regarded as two different people, with people not suspecting any correlation between them. Also, Izuku isn't just okay with what happened. He really does regret it, as seen from his last phone call with Izumi at the end. He doesn't like the fact that innocents died, but it was necessary to prove his point, which he definitely did since it was all covered live on camera for the world, or at least all of Japan, to see. The next chapter will be a lot more tame and heart-filled, but it's going to still carry the themes from this one. As for Mysterio's reveal, his specifics haven't been fully addressed yet. That's what the next chapter will do, don't worry. His official hero name, what his task as a hero, which is essentially an explanation for why he hasn't been seen or anything before, and what the public thinks of him will all be in the next chapter. I also don't think I need to explain what tricks Mysterio did in this chapter. If I do, just DM me and I'll explain it, but I think it's self-explanatory or obvious in the chapter. Just remember, he's calculating, he doesn't do things without reason. Don't assume recklessness first. I'm also a little surprised nobody picked up the irony in the last chapter with the heroes saying they weren't gonna let a villain ruin the festival and then invited him in. It's in this chapter too, where Mysterio, or the Black Figure, gives a speech to the hero pretenders, in which he himself, a fake hero, is in the crowd. Just thought that was funny. Also a little surprised that nobody caught the fact that when Izuku was changing his appearance in the last chapter, he changed from Bakugo to twice. Subtle but very informative about what Izuku really knows. I know that it seems like Mysterio is recruiting really quickly, but it's actually not. Remember that, despite the chapters being right next to one another, some amount of time is passing in between each one. So the time in which Dabi and Kota were respectively recruited was weeks apart. You'll get the students' and UA staff's reaction to the attack in the next chapter, as well as the more specific assessment of damage done from the attack. I'm, admittedly, a little unsure as to what I should do with Kota. I was originally going to put him in the Sinister Six, but now I'm a little unsure. I'm wrestling him with another potential member, since the other two I have confirmed spots for. I could just make Kota an associate, like Gentle Criminal and La Brava, though. He's necessary in the plan later, but won't actually do much until then. So I may just give him association status. Also, people fail to realize or overlook the fact that Kota is actually a year younger than Eri in canon. I kept that difference here. Also, yes, Eri, Izumi is asexual. Not a big deal but something I'm clarifying. Also, I totally feel that Izumi's theme should be something like, Mope Mope, .234 Chapter 9, received. I'm pleasantly surprised that the last chapter went as well as it did. This chapter will, in fact, be a lot tamer. Also, I do want to apologize for my wacky update schedule. I don't have set times where I work on this, so it's just whenever. I hope the length of the chapters more than makes up for that, though. Let me address some of the main points now before anything else. I thought Dabi was just the more competent choice. I do like his character a lot, but overall for this type of thing I just think he fits more of the role Izuku needs compared to Spinner. Spinner will get his moment eventually, though, don't worry. Dabi is going to have more of a character plot than Spinner would too, so that was another major contributing factor. Kota will not be a part of the Sinister Six main team, instead he will be an associate that comes in when he's needed. I had already been considering it, but yeah, he just won't have a big enough role in anything that warrants such a high position. Speaking of which, though, I do have a possible replacement for his initial spot. I'm considering the technicals of it, but I think it's a pretty good choice on my part. You'll start getting into the deeper stuff soon, but this is mainly a bit of the calm before the storm. This chapter is tamer, but will include extremely important plot points. This chapter will mainly focus on the aftermath of the attack, along with a few other things. You also get to find out a lot more about Izuku's warehouse in this chapter. It's really not what you'd expect, but in the future you'll understand why I'm making it this way. It'll probably make you want to ask questions like, who the hell is Izuku's father if he has that kind of place? Well, you'll find out eventually. I did leave hints for it in this chapter, though. I'll say now, this isn't going to be a complete Bakugo bash story. He needs to be punished for what he's done, of course, and a lot of people are gonna have it out for him, but he has a redemption arc planned. On one last note, the romance in this story is used to fuel the plot and the characters. So, it's there for a reason, not just fan service. I'm sure you know what I'm making the main pairing by now, and I just want you all to know that it's more than just straight fan service, it actually leads character development and the plot along. This will become a lot more evident in the later chapters. Current Sinister Six lineup. Izuku Midoriya Mysterio. Izumi Eri Midoriya Scorpion. Dabi Molten Man. Question mark. Opening parenthesis question mark closing parenthesis. Question mark. Opening parenthesis question mark closing parenthesis. Question mark. Opening parenthesis question mark closing parenthesis. Associates. Gentle Criminal and La Brava. Kota Izumi. I dunno what I should refer to Gentle Criminal and La Brava as. If anyone has suggestions for new aliases for them, while still fitting the theme I have in place already with the Spider-Man villains, let me know. I should probably say that sometimes, on this site, when you leave a review, it won't show up. It's a glitch in their system, I think. I get an email about it, so I can still see it, but it won't show up on the review list on the site. Don't worry, it's still there. I'm going to move my review responses up here this time. I think this lets people see them better and know things they asked for have been addressed and answered. Let me know if I should keep it up here or keep it at the bottom. Necrogod. I know that I've already said this in private, but I am going to repost it here just in case similar thoughts persist around. I'll start by saying this. Politicians don't nearly have as much influence as heroes or villains in their world. You hardly ever hear of politicians in the main series, and the amount of influence heroes like All Might had was insane, same with Stain. That's Izuku's goal, use both sides to help influence more people to support his ideals. He is a villain. What he's doing is basically the same as Stain, just a tad bit tame and done a bit differently. Just because he believes in a better hero society as a whole, and strives to change it, doesn't mean he's not a villain. This recent chapter, many civilians and heroes died just so he could prove a point. Does that sound like something a hero would do? Of course, there is a lot more to it than that, but I feel like I only needed to address the bases. Bio RL. I'm not sure as to what exactly you're referring to. Are you speaking in terms of physical enhancement or weaponry? I've never seen Bloodshot, sorry, so I genuinely don't know. Tay Storm. You'll see that in this chapter. I dunno about, awesome, but it's a very reliable excuse to use. Jessens. Yeah, I agree. He's going to remain an associate at best. Sir Godot, thanks for the praise. It means a lot. I don't think I'd put this story that high, but still I greatly appreciate it, your words do mean a lot. Tanya von de Gurekov. Not confirming nor denying the second one, but your first one made me laugh. Moses Arc Reborn 2000. Yours is long, so it's last. Kurogiri is captured here the same way as he was in canon. There weren't any changes regarding Kurogiri like that. Shigaraki will grow, just not in the same way. Izuku's really, and I mean really, busy. He's got a lot of projects just on the line to work on, which is taking his time. He did prioritize the ADAM unit, so he's now automatically producing drones, at least. That's one thing he cleared up. As for his base of operations, all of it is being kept hidden. I assure you it's secure. He has been considering other things regarding other potential safe houses though. I already addressed the Dabi and Spinner stuff above. Keeping quiet about the Meta Liberation Army and the League for now. You'll find out more about everything else in this chapter. Lastly, as always, I sincerely apologize for any grammatical or spelling errors in this chapter. I hope you all enjoy and leave a review. Approximately a total day after the attack at the Hero Billboard chart event, the teachers of UA were once again having another meeting. Everyone from the last meeting had shown up, including the detective, with a few additional people from the police force. Everyone in the room most notably had a grim facial expression, clearly not looking forward to the topic that needed to be discussed. The detective started to speak, but trailed off. He took a deep breath, almost as if he was calming himself. Is everybody ready to begin the discussion? Numerous nods occurred throughout the room. The extra people from the police began to hand out special forms and papers to all of the teachers, except Nezu. Upon looking at the first sheet of paper, many of them started to express their concerns. What is this? Present Mike spoke, holding up his own paper. A contact to give the students their full licenses a year early. Is the administration mad? The detective sighed, flipping a few papers on his clipboard. The administration wants more heroes out on the field now more than ever. Everyone turned their eyes to him, giving him their own set of curious gazes. 357 heroes died during the attack, with a similar number in those that are injured. Additionally, with new evidence coming out, many heroes are starting to experience backlash. Nezu nodded, agreeing with the detective. He spoke as well, a lot of people died during that attack. They're still trying to find bodies from the rubble. He clenched his teeth, and maybe his paws too, out of pure anger. He wasn't happy with what had happened, at all. Although a lot of people were saved, the biggest problem is that people are actually agreeing with the villain. Some of the teachers looked at Nezu with bewildered expressions, almost not believing what he said. Eraserhead folded his hands together and stared down at the table, saying just barely above a mumble, like what the villain said after the attack, people believe that if certain heroes knew how to act then the deaths could have been avoided. Some of the teachers that didn't quite understand now had some level of it, but Eraserhead wasn't done. In actuality, I agree with it as well. Shota. Present Mike roared, slapping both of his hands on the table. You can't possibly agree with what happened. That attack, just to prove a point. It's messed up. Eraserhead glared up at Mike. I don't agree with how it was shown, but the message itself I do. Though, I can understand why this villain did it the way he did. He sighed, think of it logically. Would you want those kinds of heroes on the streets? Your life in their hands. A lot of teachers looked at him questionably. Aizawa continued, I sure as hell wouldn't. He wanted to convey that message through something the entire population couldn't just turn a blind eye to. That got a lot of them thinking. A lot of the heroes that had been on the scene were, in the simplest of words, not heroes. They didn't do their job, protecting citizens from harm. A lot of them just stood by and watched as the carnage ensued. None of them wanted those kinds of heroes on the streets. I must say, I do agree with this as well. The detective spoke again, which drew everyone's eyes to him. Although the method the villain used wasn't ideal, it has brought a lot of things to light. The detective flopped a page. For one, Endeavor is being fully investigated. He's still in critical condition at the hospital, so he is unable to be questioned, but some of his family have been fairly cooperative. More specifically, Todoroki Natsuo. The hero administration has been quiet about the case, as well. A lot of the heroes present looked exceptionally grim at the mention of that, especially Toshinori. There have also been a multitude of other heroes that have had their licenses terminated from the more blunt evidence suggested, such as death arms. But, why do they want to send our students out into the field so early? Present Mike reiterated his question from before, looking at the detective with an unsure expression. I'll answer that for you, Present Mike. The door to the room opened to reveal Saragame Kenji, the chief of police. He stepped into the room with his own stack of papers on a clipboard. I apologize for my tardiness. A lot of people shook their heads to show that it was all right. The police chief turned to Present Mike. To answer the question you had, it is mainly due to the heroes we currently have in action falling short of what they are supposed to be. Some of the teachers raised a brow at this. He continued, after the attack on the Hero Billboard chart event, people's trust and faith in heroes are starting to drop. There are already mass protests in places like Musudafu, Jaku, Tokyo and Hosu. We need heroes that can not only instill that bit of faith but also hope. We need to show the people that the next generation of heroes are better. Nezu nodded in agreement. This is why I've already signed it. Many of them looked at Nezu with a look of shock. The heroes on the field right now, they aren't heroes. Our heroes, the ones we're training, they are going to have to be the face of what a hero should be. The administration is pushing for the hero course students, at least for the time being, will get their licenses a year early. The police chief spoke again. This will mean all current third years will receive their licenses immediately, second years after this last semester and the first years the following. This is all still subject to change, so please keep an open mind. Similar forms have been sent to most of the other schools in the country, as well. Not seeing any real reason to argue against the reasons given, all of the teachers readjusted themselves and signed the forms, although hesitantly. Once they were done, the forms were collected and stacked in a pile for later. Eraserhead grunted, now I have to adjust my lesson plans. This is going to be hell for them. Nezu nodded, yes. The hybrid looked toward his, arguably, best teacher and started to explain some things. Even after they get their licenses, they will still attend the school. You will still be able to teach them after they receive them, during their third year, but you should prioritize the more important things as soon as you can. The Eraser hero rolled his eyes. So, in summary, it'll be hell for them. Midnight raised her hand, respectfully interjecting herself with a question. Do you have any additional information you can share with us regarding the top heroes as a whole? Everyone is in the dark about that. Ectoplasm spoke up as well. I too have been wondering about that. With the Billboard chart having been attacked, amongst other things, what are they planning to do? The police chief hummed thoughtfully. Truthfully, I am unsure myself. A lot of the top pro heroes almost immediately fell in battle against the Nomu, in which people are beginning to lose faith in them. This may affect the way they are ranked in the future, but as I said, I am unsure. 13 raised a hand next. Do you have any information on the top heroes? Perhaps their conditions or thoughts on the matter. The police chief sighed. Endeavor is still in critical condition in the hospital. Nobody is sure as to what will happen with him after the ongoing investigation is finished. The teachers nodded, already knowing about that one. The police chief looked a little unsure before saying the next one. Although people are commending him for his outstanding call to action and quick thinking during the attack, Hawks is completely silent. Nobody has heard from him, not even his agency really knows anything. That worried a lot of them. Hawks, as was shown from him during the event, was usually a typically carefree and pretty energetic person. He would usually do things in his own unique way and people loved that about him. The fact that he was totally silent, not saying anything, was worrying. Additionally, Best Jeanist is on hiatus. Nobody has heard from him, either. Yukio and Crust were fortunate enough that their quirks gave them enough protection. They were relatively unharmed and are currently working with their agencies and people to try and calm everything down. From what we have noticed, people are commending them for doing their best to keep people safe during the attack, especially in Yukio's case in which she held up the roof to prevent people below from being crushed. A lot of them were relieved to hear that. Those two were extremely well-known and liked heroes among the populace for their good deeds and humble attitudes. They were great heroes and still are. Wash unfortunately died during the attack. Many eyes widened as the police chief took a heavy breath. He took a critical hit and it inevitably caused an internal injury that was unable to be treated. Expect this to be announced publicly soon and there will be a memorial held for him in a week's time. Seeing everyone looking grim, the police chief moved to the next one. Edgeshot suffered little to no injuries as well. After initially failing to fight the Nomu, he assisted civilians in evacuation. He is now similarly working with police to stop the protests. The teachers were once again glad to hear that another hero had done the right thing. A lot of them respected the fact that when he had failed to fight, he immediately moved to doing what he actually could do, which was helping with the evacuation. Toshinori, especially, was glad to hear that, mainly because he had worked with the ninja hero a few times and respected him for his work, as well as his abilities. The following heroes, Mirko, Yoroi Musha and Kamui Woods are all being treated for injuries. The police chief explained. Yoroi Musha had been in the crossfire of the attack that initially separated the roof from the building. His specific injuries haven't all been identified yet. Kamui Woods was crushed by a multitude of debris while helping people evacuate. Overall, his injuries are nothing too major and he should be released within the week. A lot of heroes sighed in relief at that, but they caught their breath at what the chief said next. Mirko, however, sustained much more serious injuries. Her leg, after being flung out of the area, had gotten impaled by an incredibly rusted piece of metal. A lot of heroes winced at that, their own legs starting to hurt a bit at the thought. Luckily a medical team got to her before infection could really set in, so there should be no need for an amputation, but she will still require a lot of physical therapy before she is able to return to the field. Silence ensued again after that, nobody really knowing what to say after those entire bombshells had been released upon their heads. Toshinori, though, looked to Nezu with a questioning look. The hybrid noticed and looked at the retired hero with his own curious gaze. Is there something you would like to ask, Toshinori? He nodded. A few things, actually. Nezu nodded, allowing him to ask what he wanted. Well, I was wondering if what that villain said was true. Did Yui really let something, a tormentor, into the school and allow them to become a hero? Nezu's expression turned sour at the question. Since yesterday, I've been thoroughly investigating each and every one of our current and past students. So that's why you were unreachable at all this morning and yesterday, Toshinori mumbled, Nezu nodding in confirmation. Toshinori could definitely understand Nezu's enthusiasm to get it done. Toshinori knew that Nezu had zero tolerance for people like that, considering everything the hybrid had been through in his past. Have you found anything out yet? Nezu hesitated to respond, perhaps, but it doesn't add up. Upon receiving a questioning gaze from Toshinori and a few of the other teachers, especially Aizawa, Nezu decided to continue. The only one I could find that had a questionable background was Bakugo Katsuki. He's from Aldera, a school notorious for its loose disciplinary action. Everyone else, in the hero course at least, went to schools that have little to no tolerance for any sort of behavior like that. Aizawa nodded. That is true, we never accepted anybody from a school like that before. People looked toward the tired teacher. What he said had some merit. Aldera had so many complaints, some even legally, centered around its disciplinary choices. I thought it was just his personality, but the excess anger he possesses could be something more than just that. There was also his speech at the sports festival, Midnight said, bringing up another good piece of evidence. He said that he was, admittedly, a jerk. You think there may be a little more to it? Aizawa nodded his head in confirmation, yeah. Though, as Nezu said, a lot of things don't add up. For example, why was his record completely unscathed if he used to be a bully? Present Mike rolled his eyes. That's because of Aldera. They've always wanted to get a kid into the hero course. I'm willing to bet that they saw a kid with a promising quirk walk through their doors and saw a prize. Nezu sighed. While all of that is indeed true, there is another thing that doesn't add up. First of all, detective, I'll need you to do research on this. Please look into Aldera as best as you can, as well as the students that went there. If the evidence against the school is enough, we'll pursue legal action to get them shut down. For the students, just bring me the most severe cases, I would like to personally look into them. He received a nod in confirmation. Nezu continued shortly after taking a breath, what the villain said. He spoke in past tense about the student we accepted. Aizawa hummed, so he's either a liar or he's younger than we initially thought. Nezu nodded, Aizawa sighed. A shame, really. If it's a kid, they must have had it bad to turn to villainy at such a young age. That's why I'm pushing to get this done as soon as possible, Nezu stated harshly. Detective, this is now your top priority, the spy can wait. With all due respect, sir, Toshinori interjected, gaining Nezu's attention. Isn't it unwise to take our attention away from the spy? The League may have gone quiet for now, but I still feel bad about leaving someone like that here. Nezu nodded, showing he understood what Toshinori was saying. I do not mind your interruption, do not worry. As for your concerns, if this can help us identify this villain as soon as possible, then it takes priority. The police chief also nodded his head, due to demands from multiple heroes and considering the amount of damage caused, as well as knowledge and unknown factors this villain may possess, he is now ranked at S class. Whoa, whoa. Present Mike suddenly loudly exclaimed, a little surprised at what the police chief just stated. Did you just say S class? Isn't that a little too far? It is not, the police chief confirmed firmly, yet not bothered by the interruption. We considered all of the evidence before affirming this. Not only is the information broker, who has not only sold hundreds, if not thousands, of information to villains about a multitude of different heroes, but also the person who killed the villain Overhaul, as confirmed by the villain himself. Everyone winced at the memory of the villain's body. It was truly horrifying to see. We can also assume he has the girl, Eri, in his possession, which gives him the ability to keep producing the quirk-suppressing bullets if he so wanted to. After realizing that, many of the teachers present began to get a tad nervous. Aizawa, especially, wasn't looking too well. As someone who had been present during the raid and personally saw the remains of Overhaul, he could only imagine. He has also been shown to be highly intelligent, as he was able to hack into the system at the Hero Billboard chart event, and has a variety of different resources at his disposal. There are also a variety of unknown factors about him to consider, like quirk and level of power. Thus, his rank skipped A class and went to S class. Present Mike, now sweating nervously, only gave a small nod in response. That had answered his question with a little more information than he would have been comfortable knowing. Additionally, this means this villain shares the same priority as villains Shigaraki and Twice. Was the last bit that was added, just as a reminder to not forget about the League entirely. If I may, I still have another question. Toshinori inquired, reviving a nod from both Nezu and the chief of police. The hero, the one that brought down the Nomu, there hasn't been much information about him going public and I myself haven't gotten much information on him in general. The only thing I really know is that the public seems to commend him for defeating the Nomu when everyone else failed, which is already giving him quite the reputation. Is it possible for you to give us some insight on who he is? Upon the chorus of murmured agreement amongst the teachers, the police chief nodded, looking at his own sheet of paper. His hero name is, the mystery hero, Mysterio. His quirk is unknown, as is his name and looks. He kept the dome around his head up at all times. He was very strict about those, we thought he was paranoid but didn't press on it. It is logical to keep those secrets, in case of possible spies or villains lurking in even the most unsuspecting corners. Plus, he did save a lot of lives, after all. Collective nods, aside from Nezu, occurred throughout the room. When we questioned him, we found nothing out of the ordinary. He's actually been active for a few months now. His license was confirmed as legitimate and a director of the administration vouched for him. He is also an independent hero without an agency, he claims to work better that way. Aizawa raised a brow, his attention more so grabbed after the last statement, what does he specialize in? With a flashy quirk like that I find it hard to believe we're only just hearing about him now. The police chief didn't respond right away, clearly thinking about something. This is technically classified, but since you are all heroes involved in the cases I see no reason not to inform you. The teachers sat up a bit straighter, their full attention on the chief of police. He specializes in a multitude of different aspects of hero work. He looked down at a sheet of paper. He works especially well at private investigations and is appointed to specifically follow the broker case. He has also been working on the League's case and the new Meta Liberation Army CSE as well, due to a recent surge in activity from them. I see, thank you. Toshinori thanked the police chief for answering his question, in which was responded with a nod from the dog man. I assume some of the information about the hero will be published soon. Another nod from the chief of police, yes. People are demanding to know who he is, mostly to express their thanks than anything. He saved a lot of lives by destroying the Nomu. He paused, thinking about the next thing he would say. As for information we plan to give out, it will most likely just stick to his hero name. Funnily enough, we'll cater to it. A mystery and all that. Has he found anything out yet? Midnight asked curiously. She, like most others in the room, were also wondering about this. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it. The police chief responded, earning a bout of disappointment from the staff. We do not blame him, though. The League and Meta Liberation Army are extremely secretive on their own and the broker is even more so. There is a snippet of information on the League he was able to conjure up. There is a file in the handouts that explains it, if you're interested. Some of them started to go through their handouts, browsing the pages and looking at the massive amounts of information. They found the page they were mainly looking for, about the league, beginning to scroll through it curiously. Slam. The door to the room slammed open, making everyone jump as the heroes assumed defensive positions. An officer ran into the room, a little sweaty and really nervous looking. The heroes stood down upon seeing that it was an officer, but had annoyed looks on their faces nonetheless. Pardon my intrusion. The officer was gasping for air. He must have run there from somewhere and he didn't look like he was someone that was in the best of shape. What is it, officer? The police chief asked as more of a statement. This is an important meeting. We received a distress call. The officer leaned against the wall to try and catch his breath a little better. The teachers, as well as the officers present, began to get nervous. Well, spit it out. The chief of police ordered. Who sent the distress call? The officer let in a large breath of air, looking specifically at Toshinori. Nighteye. If you asked anyone in that room what Toshinori's face had turned into, they'd tell you that the man had likely seen death itself. Around 23 hours before the initial meeting between the UA teaching staff took place, the students in Class 1A were gathered in the common area, along with Aizawa, just blankly staring at the screen. Many of them shared similar expressions, ranging from horror to petrified, or possibly even being relieved. Overall, everyone was a mess. The broadcast had forcibly shut down after the attack ended, due to multiple demands from heroes on the scene. A lot of them were still in shock, though. The whole thing was just both surreal and unreal at the same time. One of the worst-looking people had been Todoroki. His face was just horrorously blank. It was like he had seen a ghost, almost, after he saw his father's unmoving body lying on the rubble. Katsuki was just one of many people to feel an undying rage brewing within his chest. Seeing those heroes just get tossed around like that, being embarrassed, made a pit form in his stomach. He felt more fuel to his rage when he could clearly see heroes just watching the fight, or just standing around like statues. That was the whole point the villain was trying to make, and they were just proving it. That was another thing that pissed Katsuki off, was the fact that all of this, was just so the villain could prove a point. A point. That was it. Yui didn't know what to think. There was a heinous mixture of different emotions swirling around inside of her, while her expression stayed the same. On one side she was incredibly furious about what had transpired, but on another she understood. She didn't like heroes like that either. Did they deserve to be punished? Yes. Did they deserve to die? No. Innocent people died just to show that not all heroes were good. She hated that, and she was sure others were thinking the same way. Katsuki stormed out of the room, following Aizawa out after he left. Yui didn't exactly know what his deal was, because he looked to be seconds away from literally exploding. She suspected that he was going to train, or something along those lines. Perhaps something to vent his anger on, or maybe to train. Kirishima followed him, as well. Everyone else was just in too much shock to say or really do anything. It was understandable, really. Yui herself had her mind plagued by other things. Most notably, a thought that haunted her was the girl, Eri. The villain had publicly admitted to being the one that killed Overhaul, and, although the initial question was dodged, it can be assumed that he has the girl in his possession as well. The thought made Yui a little sick. Of course, she didn't exactly know what this villain was doing with her. However, the possibilities were what was getting to her. She couldn't help but think that this particular villain was doing the same thing Overhaul did, harvesting Eri's flesh into bullets that can suppress or even erase quirks. She left the dorm to get some fresh air. She didn't want to be around her classmates right now, especially when she felt like she would throw up at any given moment. The sights she saw during the attack didn't really help in the matter, either. So, she ended up roaming around various walkways on campus to try and relieve the stress she had subtly building up inside. Something did pique her curiosity, though. A hero she, nor anyone in her class, at least, had seen before swooped in to save the day. She didn't know much about that hero and she couldn't help but wonder about him or her. She really hadn't meant to pull out her phone and open Izuku's contact, but instinctively she knew about his analysis skills and thought that, just maybe, he'd end up knowing something nobody else did. She ended up calling his number and putting the phone to her ear, letting the sound of the ring fill her ear. After around 30 seconds of waiting for him to answer, the line went to his voicemail. She didn't bother to leave one, she saw no need, so she just took the phone away from her ear and ended the call. She couldn't help but stare at her phone sadly. She didn't know why she felt the way she did about him simply not answering, but she did. It was something that she had been thinking about for a while, as a matter of fact. Every so often, when she thought about him, her heartbeat would increase ever so slightly. Now, she wasn't one to know emotions. The whole thing of starting to more openly express herself and actually have certain emotions well up inside of her was still new. But, even with her limited knowledge on them, she still knew that what she was experiencing wasn't exactly normal. She wanted, so badly, to just talk to someone about it. But, the problem was, how the heck could she even do that? She initially wanted to talk to Izuku about it, but since he was the epicenter of the problem, she ended up dismissing that idea. She didn't really know if her parents would understand and knew for a fact that Toshinori knew absolutely about love or anything similar. Then there was Kendo, which was a whole different story. Then, she just considered looking it up but had trouble describing it. How could she properly describe emotions if you didn't know? She was cut off of her rambling thought train when she heard footsteps approach from the side. She stopped walking for a moment, turning her head to face the individual that she was about to intercept. She was actually surprised when she saw the face of a very familiar, blonde third year with his facial expression wearing a depressing frown. He seemed to notice her as quickly as she noticed him. He seemed to have the strength to flip his frown into a ghost of a smile and greet her with a small wave of his right hand. Hey, Kota. I was actually looking for you. He lowered his hand and began approaching her. She could already sense his depressing aura. He pointed his thumb back to the general direction her dorm was in. I was actually looking for you, but nobody back at your dorm knew where you were. Was all she could really say. She knew why he sought her out. It was most likely about Eri. She, in all honesty, held a bit of a grudge against her senior for what he did back in the alleyway when they first encountered Eri. Yui knew that he was only doing his job, but it still stung knowing that letting that girl go ultimately never led to her rescue. She kept thinking that, if she had run away with the girl that day, she would be here. Togata stood by her side, looking down at her. She looked up at him, noticing the ghost of a smile was beginning to fade from his face and return to the frown it once possessed. After a few moments of silence, he stepped forward, ahead of her a bit. He held out a hand, gesturing forward. Do you mind if I join you on your walk? I kinda want to talk to you about some stuff. She only nodded to him in response, triggering them both to continue walking. At first the two walked in silence, just silently roaming around the campus. It was clear to Yui that Togata was uncomfortable starting the conversation. It was one of the few things she could identify, mainly from experience. So, she decided to help him out. This is about Eri and the villain, isn't it? She noticed him gulp, giving a subtle nod. He obviously wasn't really looking forward to the conversation. It is, he spoke, his voice low and eerily lacking its usual cheery beat. His fists clenched instinctively, his teeth gritting. But, he calmed himself down, his fists loosening back out. He took her because of my negligence. Yui looked at him, surprised at the implication. She knew, just from that statement, that he was blaming himself for what had ultimately happened to her. You blame yourself. He nodded again, this time more obviously. He turned to look at her, his eyes carrying his emotions. They were heavy, tired, even. I shouldn't have made you let her go. I'm sure if we had to we could have beat him together easily. He looked away again, suddenly not feeling brave enough to look at her in the eyes. I failed, in every aspect of being a hero, and I don't deserve my name, Lemillion. She looked at him, and though her face didn't explicitly show it, she was shocked. Togata thought that he didn't deserve his hero name. No, it was probably deeper than that. She suddenly felt a familiarity about this situation, like how she felt after the initial failure at the raid. Lemillion was the name Togata had given himself based on his goal, she remembered. His goal, to save 1,000,000 people during his time as a pro-hero. An admirable goal that she thought was perfect for the job. Togata himself was the epitome of what a hero should strive to be. Selfless, helpful, kind, and definitely a lot more. He had his flaws, but ultimately, Goher at least, would make a great hero. She stumbled on what to say to him as he looked depressingly to the side, her lack of response likely making him think she resented him. She couldn't help but think back to the beach, the time she consulted Izuku. She remembered, word by word, what he had said to her that day. How could she not? The words he spoke had truly helped her out of funk she wasn't sure she'd even escape. When she looked at the third year in front of her, who was experiencing the same thing she had been at that time, she knew what she had to say. Before she could speak, he spoke again. I understand if you resent me for my failure. I know that. I don't resent you, Togata, she interrupted his senseless yammering with a blunt statement. She continued, but took Izuku's signature way of calming one's nerves, taking a deep breath, before continuing, a good friend of mine once told me that all heroes have their wins and losses. You can't be expected to win or succeed in every situation you come across. Sometimes you fail, and that's okay. She wasn't the best at motivational speeches, but the reason for her being so good at this one was because she literally just copied what Izuku did. Really, she was relying on him too much. Togata only looked at her, bewildered at the realization of what she said. He wiped his eyes, seemingly getting rid of tears that had been previously threatening to form. He smiled, this time a genuine smile. That's a wise friend you have there. She ended up smiling too, glad someone else recognized Izuku's motivational skill. I know. She said nothing more than that, but the message to Togata had been conveyed. He quickly recomposed himself, smiling and assuming a signature heroic pose. You're right, though, he loudly proclaimed into the sky, somewhat startling the usually timid girl. I shouldn't just give up after one failure. I need to keep fighting, for Eri's sake. He smiled down toward Yui, grabbing her hand and engaging in an intense handshake to show how grateful he was. Thank you, Kodai. She smiled and gave him her signature response, She knew that Togata no, Lemillion would give it his all to save her. She would, too. Shortly after that, the two walked with one another back to Yui's dorm where they eventually parted ways. Togata ultimately had a better attitude than before, which was good. Yui was glad she was able to help him out of the funk she had similarly been in before, even though her advice was just copy and pasted. Really, she needs to do more for Izuku. Maybe treat him to a beach day or something. Her phone dinged once she reached her dorm room. When she pulled it out, she couldn't help but think of the "speak of the devil" catchphrase. Though, now that she thought about it, was it really the same thing? Technically she didn't speak about him, only thought about him. So, does that still count toward the catchphrase? Does it warrant the use of it? That's another thing she should look up later. She refocused her mind back on the text she received, letting out a disappointed sigh but also expressing a small smile in response to what she read. Izuku, I'm sorry I didn't answer your call. I'm sorta busy at the moment. I'll call you sometime tomorrow morning, if that's alright. If you're busy I don't want to be a bother. Izuku was, at least to her, naturally self-belittling. He did it sometimes when the two talked, often putting himself down in comparison to other people. She suspected it was the result of bullying, perhaps years of it, but didn't have the proof to tell someone about it. Asking the guy directly would likely either lead to a dead end or him getting defensive, or both. She didn't really want either of those outcomes, so she just opted not to bother asking. If she did, by some way, get evidence on who bullied him, she would immediately get Toshinori involved. She couldn't exactly explain why, even if she tried, but she had this sort of protective instinct around Izuku. Not that she really complained, nor cared, about it. She, in response to his message, bluntly told him that, no, he wasn't a bother and that he could call anytime he was ready and that she would be looking forward to it. Aizawa, before he had left the dorms after the broadcast ended, had immediately told the class that they would not be having classes tomorrow. Something about a meeting, or something going on during that time. After that, he told her that he would call to talk about the possibility of hanging out. Immediately, she responded with, gladly. She flopped onto her bed, spreading her arms out onto the sheets. She had let her phone slip out of her grip when she initially landed, so it was just by her side. She couldn't help but keep the small smile on her face as she looked blankly up at the ceiling, the race in her heart suddenly returning. She knew that she could be training, or doing something similar, right then, but these feelings just confused her and made her feel so differently she didn't entirely focus on that. Despite everything that was happening recently, these strange, foreign feelings kept overriding any sense of despair the girl would ever muster up. It would always just dissolve under the other feeling which was much stronger than that could ever be. She sighed, actually giving off an uncharacteristic amount of bliss and satisfaction from it. She had a feeling that tomorrow would be a hell of a day. When Katsuki had initially stormed out of the dorm, there were a lot of things racing through his head. For one, he belittled every hero that had been in the scene. Well, not every hero. There was actually a lot of them that he greatly respected for their efforts in either the battle or rescue efforts. But, for every hero that was useless you could count another tally to Katsuki's hate list. Another thing was the point of it all. The shitty point the villain was clearly setting out to make by orchestrating the attack. It pissed him off to no end. He agreed with what the villain said, and he would admit that he felt like a dick for it, but what the villain did was unforgivable. It was pissing him off just considering it. Everything was just a shitshow nowadays. The world was falling apart with new villains popping up like they're going out of style and nobody could do a damn thing about it. Katsuki was heading straight for the Gamma Gym, aggressively stomping his way there with a snarl on his face, hands in his pockets and a mean glare that would send shivers down any normal person's spine. He stopped, though, when he heard footsteps coming from close behind him and catching up fast. Katsuki stopped his march, slightly turning his head back to glance at whoever had the nerve to follow him. Honestly, the revelation on who it was didn't really surprise him. What do you want, shitty hair? Bakugo, he said, slightly out of breath. Katsuki had made it pretty far before Shitty Hair decided to go after him. You're going to train. Katsuki scoffed, burying his hands deeper into his pockets. Ima that obvious. He turned his head away, beginning to walk to his destination again. Don't bother me. The red-haired, sharp-toothed boy looked at Katsuki nervously. He was considering asking something, but wasn't sure how the explosive blonde would end up reacting. He could end up getting offended or something and he really didn't want that. Eventually, he caved and asked, "Can I train with you?" Katsuki stopped walking again, this time turning back to fully look at him. Katsuki gave him a questioning look, expecting his reasoning. Kirishima sighed, his fist clenched and teeth starting to grit. You saw the broadcast. We all did. He looked at Katsuki, his eyes metaphorically hard and unwavering. He held a sort of determined glare that even Katsuki had to admit was admirable. If I'm going to be a hero that's going to protect people, I need to get stronger. I think you're the right person to help me with that. Katsuki only looked at him, his expression unreadable as he examined the other. Katsuki didn't exactly know if they were friends or not, it was never really something he wanted. But, what he did know was that there was a lot more taking place behind the scenes that Kirishima didn't want to say. Katsuki sighed, turning back around and motioning for the redhead to follow. Come on, shitty hair. Let's go. The spiky blonde did his best to ignore the excited cries of the other, but in the end he couldn't. A small smile ended up coming to his face, which he tried his best to shake off. It didn't work. As they silently walked to the gym, Katsuki couldn't help but think to himself. The company of others was nice, especially when he wasn't being an asshole. Now, he didn't mean the company he had during that time, but the company he had now. There were really only two people that actively hung around him, shitty hair and round Uraraka. Uraraka actually held his respect. Her attitude was something he actually admired, someone that didn't take shit from anyone and would stick up for someone she thought was hurting, unwilling to follow the masses' influence. It was something he wished he would have done. Maybe that was why he respected her so much. Shitty hair was a little different. Katsuki wondered why he always decided to stick by him. He pondered on similar thoughts with Uraraka too, but from what he could figure she thought he needed a friend and that was why she was around. But, for the redhead, he didn't really know. Katsuki remembered that he always muttered stuff about his manliness, but there had to be more to it than that. Eventually, after reaching the school and showing their student IDs to a machine, they were able to make it to the gym. Katsuki took off his overshirt, leaving him in just a tank top, and began to move to one end of the gym. Kirishima looked at him, a tad confused. When Katsuki had reached the spot that he wanted to be in, he looked at Kirishima expectantly. Well, what are you doing, shitty hair? Kirishima jolted a bit from the sudden urgency and harshness of his words. You said you wanted to train, so let's fucking go. Kirishima looked at the blonde, who in turn only glared at him. The redhead eventually chuckled, getting right to it, I guess. He quickly jogged over to the other end of the gym, staring down Katsuki with a fierce and ready look. After a few moments of silence, with Katsuki not saying or doing anything, Kirishima tilted his head and spoke, how do we exactly start? He was evidently interrupted by the sound of fierce explosions being set off across the gym. Kirishima tensed and instinctively hardened himself. Katsuki was coming, his wasn't fast. The explosive blonde increased his altitude a bit, allowing him to fly up in the air. After letting off a few shots that propelled him upward, he corrected his aim to where he would land on Kirishima, readying his hands to explode when they touched him. Kirishima watched him attentively, so right before Katsuki was in reaching distance of him he performed a duck and roll in the forward direction. He timed it right to where he would exit his roll when Katsuki hit the ground. When all went according to plan and Katsuki got the ground, letting off an explosion that filled the area in smoke, Kirishima quickly stood and readied his hardened fist to strike the explosive blonde in the face. Katsuki was actually surprised by the sudden move, barely moving his head out of the way of the punch. Kirishima has ended up grazing his cheek, his hardened skin cutting it and spilling a small amount of blood. Katsuki was quick to move again before Kirishima could land his next attack, going on the defensive. Kirishima was letting loose a variety of different basic attacks, strictly using his hardened fists to try and punch Katsuki. Katsuki doubted any normal physical attack would work on Kirishima, just due to his hardened state being so hard to even move, not to mention how durable it is. However, when Katsuki saw an opening he let loose a powerful explosion into the redhead's side. The redhead only smirked, after being stunned for only a second. That won't work on me, explosion boy. Katsuki let out a tch as he went back to repeatedly dodging his attacks. It was getting annoying and he could feel himself starting to lose balance after doing it so many times. The training Kirishima had done throughout being a UA student ultimately increased the strength and durability of his hardened form. Katsuki knew he couldn't just keep dodging forever, and he also knew that Kirishima may not exactly run out of steam just yet. He needed to wear him down in a more aggressive way. Thinking fast, Katsuki dodged a punch that was meant for his face and aimed both of his toward Kirishima's gut. The spiky blonde immediately fired fairly large explosions into Kirishima's chest, actually sending the redhead back a bit, but not so much doing a lot of damage. Katsuki, however, was sent a lot further back. It was a part of his plan. He needed to create some distance, first, then he could attack more freely. Katsuki landed a good distance away, getting Kirishima's attention and triggering him to charge. Katsuki had other plans, though, quickly stretching out one of his hands and forming a circle with his other. He put the circle in front of the palm of the outstretched hand, firing an explosion through the circle. The explosion created a concentrated blast beam that flew directly at Kirishima, who was initially surprised to see the attack and could only block it. Katsuki smirked, seeing the attack hit its mark and the smoke surrounding the redhead. It was his AP shot, a fairly powerful attack that worked perfectly in situations like this. After a moment, the smirk faded upon seeing the redhead still standing and beginning to charge again. Katsuki glared forward, his hands still in their previous position. He would have to keep up the attacks then. He then began using a rapid-fire version of that attack, AP shot, autocannon. The explosion power is a little reduced, but that shouldn't matter due to the sheer amount of shots being fired. Upon the onslaught of explosions heading his way, Kirishima assumes a defensive pose. He put his two arms up in a cross to help block his face. Some of the shots went off their mark, but that was fine, as most of them hit their target and made Kirishima get pushed back. Katsuki, after around 30 full seconds on non-stop firing, felt like it was enough and decided it was time to apply a finishing move. He stopped firing the explosive projectiles, and upon doing so immediately took the chance to blast himself back into the air. Kirishima noticed this, quickly trying to recover from the attack, and once again prepared himself to dodge an incoming attack. Katsuki then performed the same attack he had done when the match started, adjusting himself in the air and beginning to launch himself forward with his hands ready to strike. Kirishima applies his same strategy to dodge the attack, going into a duck and rolling a small hit forward. Katsuki knew he would do this though, and prepared for it. When Kirishima went into his duck and began to roll, Katsuki prematurely fired off two powerful explosions that cancelled out his forward momentum. He landed swiftly on the ground, quickly pivoting himself and preparing his right palm to hit Kirishima as soon as he came out of his roll. Needless to say that when Kirishima came out of the roll, his face was met with a palm full of a powerful explosion. Katsuki let it rip, blasting Kirishima straight in the face and making the redhead fly back a bit. However, he lost his balance when trying to steady himself and began to fall on his back. Katsuki took this as a prime opportunity, rushing forward with a few explosions and pushing the redhead to the ground. A palm rested on Kirishima's face as Katsuki used his knee and foot to pin one of his arms, while his free hand pinned the other. After a few moments of pointless struggle, Kirishima relented and hit the ground twice to show he surrendered. Katsuki took the hint and got off of him, standing up straight as Kirishima sat up on the floor. The redhead let out a light chuckle, looking at Katsuki with a slightly nervous expression. "So, how'd I do?" Katsuki glared down at him for a few moments, carefully considering his next words. After a moment, he sighed and reached a hand out to the other. "You need to fucking learn how to fight properly." Kirishima looked surprised at both the words and the gesture. He gladly took the hand with Katsuki helping him stand by roughly yanking him upward. Katsuki continued, "You could have had me in the first half. If you knew how to properly use fighting techniques, I'd be out." Kirishima let out more of a genuine laugh, this time. Katsuki guesses that he was just embarrassed by his performance before. Kirishima rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, I guess I should really get some lessons. I've been considering it for a while, but I wasn't really sure how to go about it." HMPH, Katsuki puffed, walking a bit away. He crossed his arms, thinking for another moment. "If you're serious about this training, then I can help teach you. Just plain brawling won't help you in the long run." Without even having to turn around, he knew that Kirishima was looking at him with an expression mixed with shock, amazement and wonder. "So manly," he ended up muttering, just loud enough for Katsuki to hear, which made the explosive blonde softly scoff. "Thank you, Bakugo. I won't let you down." Katsuki smirked, proud that not only about his friend's determination to get stronger, but the fact that he had a new training partner. Katsuki's eyes widened. Did he just consider Shitty Hair his friend? He rapidly shook his head, he had other stuff to focus on. Katsuki quickly pivoted himself to face the redhead, a sadistic smile on his face. Kirishima would be lying if he said that the look didn't both excite him and make him terrified for his life. "Alright then, Shitty Hair, let's." Excuse me. A voice spoke from the gym's entrance, getting the two's attention. The two boys looked to the entrance to see a fairly nervous brunette twiddling with her fingers. I was wondering if you, It was Uraraka. She was clearly trying to ask something, but was having trouble getting it out. Katsuki frustratingly sighed. Sometimes he wished people would be more open, like he was. Luckily, he knew how to trigger her enough to respond normally. Come on, round face, say what you need to say. I don't have all day. She suddenly snapped out of her incoherent babbling to glare at Katsuki and accusingly point at him. My name is Uraraka. Got that? It's Uraraka. Get it in your head. Katsuki smirked. He didn't know exactly why she got that way over a simple nickname, but in situations like these he found it both useful and hilarious. Speak then, like I said I don't have all day. She then snapped out of her angry pouting and began to get nervous again. Katsuki nearly groaned, about to comment something again but stopped when she opened her mouth to actually speak. Actually wonder if you'd train me too. She started to drift her voice into a more quieter tone, but he still heard all of what she said. Hell, he was just barely able to hear her say that she overheard them training and talking. He looked at her, surprised that she had just asked him to train her. He already knew why, so he wasn't exactly going to ask. In the end, his sadistic smirk returned. She noticed and shivered in her place. Join shitty hair over there. She tilted her head at him, admittedly a little confused. Katsuki didn't know why she was confused. All he did was tell her to go stand next to Kirishima. Did he look like the kind of guy to blow someone up if they asked to train with him? Actually, yeah, that was probably it. Wait, you're just gonna let me? You don't want to know why. Get the fuck over there, round face. He boomed, loud explosions also coming off of his palms. She quickly scurried her way over to Kirishima, who was only softly chuckling at the banter. Once Uraraka found her place next to Kirishima, Katsuki began to explain what was going to happen. Alright, you two, he pointed to them, getting their attention, versus me, he pointed his thumb at himself. This is so I can judge your teamwork and how well you work together. They deadpanned at him. Katsuki was confused. Why were they deadpanning at never mind, he knew. It made him mad, but he knew. Katsuki was never one to work too well with a team. What he said wasn't a lie, though. It was all a practical test to see what he needed to focus on with them. In certain circumstances, team training could be a lot more beneficial for learning if the people involved were better with the style. Katsuki fully intended to take this training incredibly seriously, for both himself and them. The two in front of him assumed combative positions when Katsuki let off small pops from his palms. They were nervous. Good. Katsuki's sadistic smirk was proudly displayed on his face as he spoke. Get ready, because this training will be hell for you. At that moment, when Katsuki rushed forward with his explosions from across the gym, the two had no idea how serious he was actually being with that statement. The next day came around very, very slowly for Izuku. When he got home after everything, he let out a loud and obnoxious groan that made Izumi practically jump from being startled. The two still slept in the same bed, after all, since, for one, she wasn't exactly completely comfortable to sleep on her own yet, and two, she didn't even have a room for her to sleep in. She had asked him how things went, but he was just too tired to respond to her questions and just opted to go to bed. He was barely even able to message Yui back after she had called him earlier. Izumi understood and quietly left him be as he drifted off to sleep. The whole ordeal took literally the whole day, so it was nighttime then. Izumi would just get in the bed when she was ready to sleep, no problem there. He groggily woke up the next morning feeling a lot better than he had been the night before. He did his best not to wake Izumi when he got out of bed and quickly moved to take care of what he needed to do for the morning. As he got ready, he could help but consider the previous day's events. The day itself had been incredibly wild. Even he couldn't entirely believe that it even happened, and he was the one that orchestrated the thing. He sighed, first thinking about what Izumi had told him about Kota. The kid was someone that did share their ideology but ultimately lacked the resolve necessary to act on it. Upon further pondering, Izuku thought I'd be best keeping him at arm's length as an associate. He would definitely be useful for later events, but for now he wasn't. Dabi's support equipment was pretty much ready, too. All that needed to really be done was have them properly field tested, but Izuku knew that the designs were good. He supposed he could call him over to the warehouse to test them out. So, he sent an incredibly cryptic text to him detailing where the warehouse location was. Dabi was smart, he'd figure it out, Izuku mused. Imagine Izuku's surprise when only 20 or so minutes after he sent the message, Dabi messaged him back saying he'd be there in an hour. Well, it was no big deal, really. It wasn't like he really needed to rush. An hour was plenty of time, and he already finished getting ready for the most part. His mother had just finished making breakfast, so she was currently setting the table up to eat. He had to wake up Izumi, who really didn't want to wake up to eat. Eventually, the family of three sat down at the table and ate their breakfast. It was spent mostly in silence, but there were a few light conversations here and there. Inko had told Izuku that the project he had asked her to work on was almost done and it would only be a matter of days now, which made him glad. He would have to contact someone later in the day to make preparations for something, if that was the case. Izuku had told his mother and sister that he would be heading to the warehouse after eating, even though the day was meant to be a break day. Izumi looked at him suspiciously, somehow knowing he was hiding something. He just told them he wouldn't be there for too long and he'd be back, at least, before midday. Just a quick checkup on something, he'd said. They seemed to accept that answer, so it wasn't brought up again. The rest of breakfast went by without trouble with the family of three enjoying their meal. Izuku did as he said he would and left the apartment to go to his warehouse after eating. Izumi gave him a weird look as he left, but Izuku just brushed it off as mere curiosity and kept going on his way. It didn't take him too long to get there and make sure everything was properly set up before going back outside to wait for his guest. He had only been really waiting for a few minutes when he saw the same hood from the day at the food court begin to approach him. Izuku waited for him to get a little closer before he greeted him. "You're here, finally. You were, 2 minutes late." He barely saw him till his eyes from under the hood. "Whatever, you said you wanted to talk about stuff." Izuku nodded, motioning him to come along. "Follow me." Dabi followed him through the doors of his warehouse, which led to an extraneous large room that looked pretty plain. It looked like a normal warehouse, for the most part, consisting of a very open workspace. What confused Dabi though, was the extreme lack of anything in the room. He let down his hood and took it off as he followed Izuku to a nearby wall. The greenette offered to carry his hoodie, which Dabi didn't want to refuse, so he handed it to the boy who tied it around his waist. He didn't ask any questions when Izuku started pushing on random slots of the wall, nor did he really pay attention to it until he heard a fairly loud ding. More curiously, he looked ahead at the wall which was now opening up to reveal an elevator. Izuku looked back at him as he stepped into the fairly large elevator, and chuckled. "Yeah, I know, I was surprised too when I first found this." Dabi quickly realized that he must have been wearing some weird expression on his face and quickly shook it away, following his boss into the elevator. Izuku's right hand found itself pressing a button, in which the elevator doors closed and began descending, some music even starting to okay in the background. When Dabi looked over to the buttons, he was thoroughly shocked at the amount of them. "What the hell is this place?" Izuku laughed this time. "That was basically my reaction when I found this," he simply said, before catching his breath. He began to explain. "My mom first told me about this place over a year ago. It used to belong to my father, apparently." He then muttered something about the damn bastard not sending a paycheck to his mom for a few months now. "It was practically abandoned when I moved my stuff in here, but this place has a lot to it. I've explored most of the place and claimed a lot of the individual rooms for a variety of things. You have the main rooms, which is what the elevator entrance is always going to be connected to. There is also a pretty large labyrinth of pathways down there, it's like a maze. It's not a problem for me, since I've basically memorized the entirety of it, but you could get lost if you're not careful. Connected to those pathways are even more branching rooms, too. So, this place has quite the underground system. There's also a separate staircase on the other side of the elevator, just in case, I guess." Dabi glanced down at his boss with a bewildered expression. He just couldn't believe that this place even existed, legally. How the hell did the bills for this place get paid? Oh, wait, from what he's heard he's rich. Dabi remembered hearing from Toga and twice about how much of a maze the Yakuza base was, so either this place was like that or even more so. His curiously piqued, he couldn't help but ask, "So, you got any of the rooms section for specific stuff?" Izuku looked at him. "Well, sublevel 1 is usually where I tinker and work on stuff. A lot of my materials are on that level, along with a majority of other things. Sublevel 2 is more of a storage space for a lot of stuff. I have a lot of things there ranging from really important and practically useful to next to junk. A lot of finished projects are also stored there, too, if I need them to be. Sublevel 3 is where we're going, it's strictly a field testing site. I also have random rooms, sectioned off in the labyrinth, with important stuff in them. The randomness of it can be useful in the event the place gets raided or scouted somehow. Also, did I mention there's traps? My father must have been a paranoid type of person because there's a lot of them in random pathways. There's also a section on sublevel 3 that's got prison cell-like rooms, so. Traps. Prison cells. Dabi was beginning to think this place was something much more than just a warehouse. It was like it used to be a full-on battle station or something. Just who exactly was his father? Just then, the elevator dinged again and the doors opened to reveal another really large room. The roof was really high up and the walls were incredibly spaced out. There was a surprising lack of an echo, too. This particular room had a space sectioned off by glass, most likely the testing area Izuku spoke about. There were also at least 4 to 6 different hallways attached to this one room, Dabi also noticed. Another realization came to him, that elevator trip took a while. Izuku looked at him once they reached the glass, a presumably blast-proof door being the only entrance into the sectioned room. It was really white in there, too, with the walls being exceptionally bright. Izuku responded, yeah, the place is huge. That's why a lot of branching rooms and stuff are empty. I don't need all of the space. Though, like I said before, if the place is ever raided it's really useful. He turned toward the door, opening it up and going inside of the room. Dabi followed him in as he spoke again. Sub-level 4 is exceptionally smaller than this, for some reason. Sub-level 5 is roughly the same way. I have those two sectioned off for their own purposes. Sub-level 4 houses a machine of mine that automatically produces something for me and sends it down to sub-level 5. He then hummed thoughtfully, I've actually been curious about discovering a sub-level 6, or at least a hidden room, somewhere. I've found old clues lying around but have never actually found out how to get there. The two reached a table, which was next to a lot of other tables, in the room. It was really close to the glass and had some equipment on it, presumably his new support gear as he previously mentioned. Izuku reached for two things on the table with both of his hands. Izuku turned to him after picking them up, holding them out for him to grab. Here, put these on. Dabi curiously inspected the devices. They looked like gauntlets, of sorts, with a thin metal-looking glove at the end with thicker pieces of metal leading down to his forearm. The color matched his scars, as well. Dabi put them on easily enough, able to slide his hand through it until his hand reached the glove. Surprisingly the glove was extremely flexible, with him able to pretty freely move his fingers around. The part that wrapped around his scars on his forearm was also quite snug yet loose, which Dabi would admit was fairly comfortable. The inside layer was also made out of some kind of fabric, though Dabi didn't know what. Izuku began to explain, these will help you with a few things, most notably your fire control. You can still produce your fire as well as you could without these, too, and they're extremely heat resistant so they won't be of any risk. Dabi looked at him like he didn't believe it, until he generated a flame in his left hand. He felt absolutely none of the heat that usually radiated off the fire. It was almost surreal. Izuku continued, there is also another mechanic that I'm quite excited to see in action. Tell me, do you have to focus and alter your flame projection so prevent excess spread? Donnie nodded, looking at his boss with a blank expression. He did, in fact, have to actively focus on how much the flame spread when he released it. Sometimes it would hinder him in a fight, since he actively needed to have his mind set on that and would logically make him a little less focused on his surroundings. Well, now you don't have to worry about it. Here, Izuku attached something to the back of Dabi's head, suddenly. It was pretty small and relatively unnoticeable, actually hiding behind his hair so it couldn't be seen. It's a chip that reads brain waves. Only works with small projects like this, though, so I can't use it for bigger stuff. Anyway, try thinking of how much you want to alter the spread using a funnel, almost. Dabi was confused by the explanation, but did his best to do it anyway. He thought about his spread and how much he wanted to alter it, thinking of firing a thin beam-like torrent of fire using a small funnel. The thicker piece of metal around his forearm began to unlatch from the foundation and fold over around his hand, forming the tight funnel shape Dabi desired. It went further than his hand could reach, as well, likely because in order to properly funnel the flames it needed to be out further. He looked at the device with a surprised expression, looking at Izuku for an explanation, it's so you don't have to actively focus on altering the spread. Now you can use this to automatically adjust it using that funnel, and as a bonus you still get the heat protection so you don't have to worry about burning yourself and can use attacks for longer periods of time. Before you ask, the funnel can be altered mid-attack if you want, but it takes a second or two to fully change. Dabi looked back at the gauntlet-type device that was currently around his hand and forearm. It was amazing, something he'd been hoping to get to help him since a young age. As another test, he expanded the funnel to its maximum. It immediately extended outward, but since it didn't have enough metal to complete the full funnel at first some extra panels were separated from the pre-existing ones, making the funnel a little thinner. Izuku told him that, if he wanted, he could release as much fire as he wanted, as long as it was pointed at the wall ahead of them. Dabi didn't need to be told twice, keeping the funnel at its maximum spread and releasing a large torrent of blue fire at the far wall. He didn't focus on how much he would limit its spread at all, just releasing the fire. The fire completely expanded out to the funnel's size, and the spread was humongous. After a full minute, in which Dabi would have usually ceased his attack due to his sensitivity to heat, he stopped. The fire didn't burn his skin like it usually did. Yeah, sure, it heated up the room and would make them sweat that way, but the usual sensitivity he had with the flames on his skin was no longer present. He supposed he had the boss's mysterious heat-resistant materials to thank for that. He formed the funnel into a much smaller form, the thinner metal rewatching itself, becoming thicker, and folding into form a small circle. It only took a second or so for the funnel to change, as well, just like the last time. He fired again, this time with a straighter and more beam-like torrent of flame. He stopped after about a few seconds that time, looking at his hand with an amazed look. It was like a dream. Izuku noticed Dabi's amazed expression and went over to the table again, getting Dabi's attention. He hadn't been paying too much attention to it before, but there were other things on the table. One that got the most of his interest was an outfit that looked very similar to his current villain uniform. Izuku patted a few times on the table. I take it you're interested in this. When Dabi gave him a small nod, he smirked. Well, why don't you try it on? It's not made of metal, but the material used to make it is extremely heat resistant. It's modeled and based off of your already existing outfit, as well, so there shouldn't really be any problem. Try it on. Dabi did. He had to take the gauntlets off first, though. For the most part, it was a lot like his current outfit, but it also had its fair few changes. For one, the undershirt he used to wear was replaced with a more full-body suit that covered his entire body, aside from his head, with a dark purple, blackish fabric. It wasn't uncomfortable, snug, but not uncomfortable. Additionally, over top of that, he also had a large dark blue coat, similar to the one he usually wore, except this one was a lot cleaner, neater, not ripped and overall more professional looking. He also wore large, dark-colored pants that had the ends of the pant legs tucked into his boots. He assumed the material they were made of was similar to the full-body suit's material, in which it wouldn't be too vulnerable to fire. Speaking of the boots he wore, they were incredibly made, weirdly. The material clearly wasn't the usual material boots were made of. They also felt snug, but also incredibly thin around his feet. He ended up asking his boss about them. The case with the boots is similar to the case for the gauntlets, Izuku told him. The boots, like the gloves, are meant for you to freely produce flames without you having to hinder yourself. I can assume that you're able to generate flames from places other than just your hands, right? Dabi nodded. Then why don't you try emitting a flame from your feet? A simple outward kick would suffice. Limit yourself how you'd like, this is only a test. Dabi looked from Izuku to the open area ahead of him. What he was about to do was something he couldn't pull off for ages due to how impractical it was. He smiled. May as well go big or go home, right? In one swift motion he lifted his right leg and thrust it forward, creating a large burst of blue flame. Holy shit, he muttered, amazed at the face he felt no backlash of heat or that the clothes he wore didn't start to instantly burn away. Izuku chuckled, somewhat amused at Dabi's continuous amazement. I apologize for not being about to create a proper funnel for your boots like I did the gauntlets. There were just some complications with implementing them. It's fine, Dabi quickly responded, a satisfied smirk on his face. He turned to the table, picking up the gauntlets and putting them back on. He had or should set them on the table to put on the new outfit, and with the gauntlets on now it felt like everything came together. I've never felt this good in ages. He turned to Izuku, a questioning look on his face. You mind if I practice a bit? Izuku raised an eyebrow, but smirked as well. By all means, go for it. Just go further into the room. Dabi nodded, walking himself further into the room until he was a reasonable distance away. After a deep breath of preparation, he started performing semi-practiced moves. He started off by launching a burst of flame from his left hand, then quickly followed by him spinning to the left and raising his foot to let out a horizontal wave of fire, followed by even more moves. Izuku could subtly notice the funnel on Dabi's new gauntlets quickly moving in and out at times. Izuku himself was amazed as Dabi practiced. Just by analyzing his movements, Izuku knew that Dabi didn't have much experience with the moves he practiced. The movements were a bit slow at times, perhaps because of the funnel's full 1 to 2 second change time. He could possibly change that, but wasn't sure. In the end, though, Izuku felt pride in the fact he made successful gear for someone else. He considered this a good first trial run before he finished Izumi's suit. After a few more minutes of practice, Dabi seemed out of breath. It was highly likely to Izuku that Dabi didn't have the best stamina. He came back over, somewhat panting but still had that smile on his face. Works like a dream, boss. I'm glad. Feel free to take everything with you, too. Izuku told him, which surprised the scarred man a bit. It'll do you no good, hold up down here. Put the stuff to good use, yeah. Dabi only nodded, unable to say anything in response. He had already expressed his thanks and didn't really know what much else to say. Also, I have a few suggestions for possible new uses for your quirk. Would you like to hear them? Izuku suddenly asked, getting Dabi's full attention. Dabi nodded, attentively listening. Well, for one, have you ever considered using your fire to propel yourself in the air, or at the very least hover so you don't fall? I've seen Endeavor do it a few times, so I was curious as to whether it would be possible for you to accomplish as well. Despite the name of the bastard hero making him angry, he put serious thought into the suggestion. It actually hadn't occurred to him to try that before. It was actually a sort of appealing idea, and a useful one at that. Without saying anything in response, Dabi walked back to the spot in the room where he had previously been practicing. He took a deep breath and reined his focus, starting to emit a small flame from under his feet. After he first started the small flame, he began to slowly work him way up to higher levels until it was eventually powerful enough to start lifting him from the ground. The amount of power he was putting into the flames under his boot was insane. Though, Dabi did know that if he learned and practiced this more he could lessen the amount of flame he was letting out. He started to go higher and higher into the air, but the further he ascended the less balance he had. He started to stumble in the air, somewhat panicking and blasting flames from his hands to try and keep himself balanced. Needless to say the thrashing in the air didn't do him much good and ultimately led to him falling from the air and landing flat on his back, sliding on the ground a bit due to the acceleration the flames had given him before he could put them out. He heard the faintest laughter coming from across the room and he glared at the source. He quickly got up, brushed himself off and went back over to his boss. He was a tiny bit grumpy, now. His boss still laughed a bit, but it devolved into small chuckles by now. Sorry for laughing, it just gets me sometimes. Dabi gave him a half-assed glare. In reality he didn't really care, but he had an image to keep so he had to look intimidating. But, really, if you practiced that more you could make good use of that skill. There are other things I was thinking could be useful, like covering the majority of your body in fire as a defensive and offensive move, but I'm not entirely sure about them. We'd have to come back here and practice some other time. Dabi only nodded, acknowledging that what his boss said was right. Dabi knew that if he got the hang of that it would help him a lot, so he made it one of his goals to attain in the near future. He would be sure to also consider the possibilities of a lot of other possible uses for his quirk. Oh, I put them here so I wouldn't forget. The greenette turned around, quickly went over to the table and picked up a few small objects. He then went back over to Dabi and held them out for him to grab. Dabi confusingly raised a brow. There were 2 syringes and 2 bowls of liquid in his hands. They're sedatives, preferably to be used on Nighteye. The syringes have nothing in them yet, so you'll have to fill them. About half of the vial of liquid should be enough to knock him out, but if you inject him with more than that it won't kill or injure him. It may actually knock him out for longer, actually. Ah, Dabi breathed out, taking the items and putting them into his fairly deep hoodie pockets. He would have to use them sparingly and make good use of them. Izuku began to lead Dabu back toward the door, with Dabi never taking off his new things. As they walked back toward the elevator Dabi spoke, so, how'd everything go yesterday after you saved the day? Even though Dabi was behind him, Izuku knew he had a cheeky smirk on his face to go along with the amusement in his tone of voice. Izuku only groaned, it was terrible. I hate the media and all of the stupid stuff they make you go through at the police station. How can heroes take that, much less want all of that? Dabi shrugged as the 2 stepped into the elevator. Izuku pushed a button to go up to the ground level with the elevator doors closing shortly after. Dabi took the time to respond, I don't get it either. But the ones that want the limelight all of the time just make them stand out as people that don't deserve to be heroes. Izuku nodded. He turned his head to look at Dabi a little better before speaking again. I noticed you improvised a little off of the script yesterday. Any particular reason why? Dabi shrugged, the sheets you gave me were incredibly detailed and sometimes hard to follow. I almost messed up once or twice, and I thought, instead of making a fool of your name and reputation, I should improvise. Izuku chuckled, fair enough. I noticed that you used yourself to martyr Endeavor's reputation. I didn't think you'd go that far. I do what I have to do. It's not like anyone's any wiser now than they were before, Dabi said nonchalantly, glancing over at Izuku. There's also a few things I want to ask, like why you know so much about me but I know next to nothing about you. Izuku sighed, finally looking at him fully, you're right. I should try to open my inner trust circle a little more, especially with teammates. Izuku did his best to put on his friendliest smile, holding out his hand in a gesture of a handshake. I'm Midoriya Izuku. The form you see of me now is my real form. Nice to meet you. Dabi looked at him with an expression mixed with both surprise and suspicion as Izuku held his hand out. Izuku felt like Dabi was analyzing him, like he was making sure what he was seeing wasn't some sort of trick or illusion. After a few moments, Dabi reciprocated the gesture, shaking his hand and shifting his eyes in another direction in a show of awkwardness. Nice to meet you, I guess. You know about me already, so there's no need for me to introduce myself fully to you. After a few seconds of handshaking, the two split off. Understandable, Izuku commented. We're probably going to end up seeing one another more often, so we'll learn more about one another in time. Dabi looked at him weirdly for another few seconds before shrugging, alright. Also, was that part in the script about Yui accepting your tormentor real or just shit pulled out of your ass? Izuku never responded directly, but he made a clear reaction in his sudden stiffness and averting his eyes as much as possible. Dabi knew he was uncomfortable with the subject, similar to how he himself was about some stuff in his past. But despite that, Dabi knew he left that in on purpose. He scoffed, just another reason things need to change. While the elevator still hadn't reached its destination, Izuku looked at him curiously after recovering from his little situation. Was there something else you wanted to ask? You said, questions, earlier, as in plural. Dabi nodded. Yeah, I was curious, since I noticed it, but you seemed a little upset about the casualties. Was something wrong? Izuku looked at him and frantically waved his hands in front of him, in an extraneous dramatic show to tell him that it was a misunderstanding. No, it wasn't. Well, maybe. Izuku sighed at his own confusion, looking away a bit while Dabi raised an eyebrow. I'm not entirely used to the fact we had to sacrifice innocence for the cause. It's not nearly as bad as I thought I'd be, initially. He looked back at Dabi, a look of resolve clear on his face. When I first started this whole thing, I told myself I would get this done by any means necessary. I still abide by that. Dabi only stared at him, his judging gaze piercing through Izuku like edge shot using his quirk. After what felt like an eternity to Izuku, Dabi's gaze softened as he shrugged, looking forward toward the elevator doors. Sometimes you only need to use the means at hand. Don't go rushing into something you're too unprepared to do. Izuku looked at him for a moment, truly considering those words as the elevator finally dinged. He was right, in a sense. If Izuku wasn't ready to go, any means necessary, then he shouldn't rush himself into doing it. Izuku knew that Dabi knew the possibilities as for what it could do to your personality if you went too far too quickly, or at all. But, Izuku was determined to see this through. For now, he'd keep doing what he needed to do by any means necessary. He was in too deep not to slow down now anyway. The doors of the elevator opened and the two quickly walked out. Before he ended up forgetting, Izuku took Dabi's hoodie off of his waist and tossed at the scarred man. Think fast. Dabi did not think fast. Instead of catching the hoodie, it ended up laying over his face like a blanket. Izuku genuinely laughed, somewhat amused. Dabi only groaned as he yanked the thing off of his face and began putting it back on. You should work on your reaction time. By the way, this smells. Do you even shower? Dabi glared at him for a second, but ended up developing his own smirk. Smells better than this room. Do you ever clean this place? Izuku waved a dismissive hand. Not necessary. Plus, I'm too busy to preoccupy myself with that stuff. Dabi rolled his eyes, his grin never leaving. He was clearly enjoying the banter. Whatever. By the way, about Izu ni. Who is this? A voice shouted from the doorway, causing both males' heads to snap in that direction. Dabi immediately went on the defensive, aiming his right palm, which was now fitted with his new gauntlet, at the doorway. He had the funnel in its smallest diameter, intending to shoot a small beam of blue fire to minimize damage. His hand glowed a familiar bright blue flame. Dabi, wait. Izuku ordered, looking at Dabi expectantly. He held his arm out in a way that said, stop. Dabi did as he was told, extinguishing the flames and putting his arm down. That didn't stop him from glaring at the now cowering girl at the doorway. Who is this? He asked quite coldly. Izuku sighed, almost disappointingly. This, Dabi, is my sister, Izumi. After he gave a small gesture with his hands to Dabi, he looked at Izumi and gave a similar gesture in Dabi's direction. Izumi, this is Dabi. He's a teammate. Dabi. She moved her hands away from her face, which had been moved there during her cowering fit when Dabi threatened to cremate her. Dabi let out a HMPH, putting his hands into the pockets of his hoodie and looking at Izuku with a half-assed glare. Didn't we just have a conversation about you telling me shit? And, teammate. He looked at Izumi with an analytical gaze. Aren't you a little young for this? Izuku sighed again. Izumi couldn't help but slightly shudder under Dabi's intimidating gaze, unable to respond to Dabi's comment about her age. Honestly, her reaction was a lot tamer than he'd thought it would be. He supposed that this was his fault. He should have absolutely stressed that what he was doing was specifically something he'd do alone. He should have more carefully considered her skeptical glances at him earlier. He was an idiot. Now, the poor girl was almost incinerated. Izuku decided to respond to Dabi's earlier question. Yeah, sorry. I was going to introduce you eventually, when I felt you both were ready for it. Dabi glanced at him, then to Izumi. He could clearly see that she was unstable, for lack of a better term. He knew something was up with that, but decided not to push the issue, especially with said girl in the room. He had his fair share of traumatic experiences in his life, too. Dabi didn't respond to Izuku, instead going up to the girl and holding out his hand. This surprised the siblings, who had clearly not been expecting such a gesture from him. Sorry if I startled you. I get jumpy sometimes. I look forward to working with you. Dabi handled that pretty professionally. But, Izuku knew it was more than just professionalism. Izuku knew what Dabi had been through in his past, knew his experiences. Perhaps it was more of him having an understanding of her, through analyzing the connect clues. Izumi warily looked at the outstretched hand for a few seconds before tremblingly shaking it. There was only one shake before Dabi let go, heading toward the door, intending to leave. But, before he fully left, he stopped walking and started to speak, about Nighteye. When I take care of him, where do you want him? Izuku didn't take too long to respond. It depends on what you do, but if you want to capture him, I prepared a holding cell down in the prison-like place I was talking about before. We can put him in there. Dabi only gave a hum of acknowledgement before he walked out the door and away from the warehouse. Izuku and Izumi sort of blankly stared at the door for a full minute before Izumi turned to look at her brother. That's our teammate. Izuku sighed. Yes, that's a teammate. Sorry about that, I was trying to wait for you to, recover a bit more before I had you two meet. Izumi just looked at him for a moment before a small smile made its way onto her face. It's okay. I am a little upset you kept it from me, but I know you were just looking out for me. This is my fault, anyway. She looked back at the doors, pondering something. Did you notice his reaction, though? For a villain of his caliber, it took me off guard. Izuku also looked back toward the doors. I did. He's not exactly the kind of villain you think he is. He's been through a lot in his life, and I think some of him gets what you've been through. She looked at him, her eyes unsure and questioning. You told him about what happened to me. Her voice wavered at the memory, which nearly made Izuku flinch. He went over to her, putting an arm around her to help ease her. It worked, as she snuggled into him comfortably. No, I didn't. But, I'm sure he recognizes it. Not just from his own experiences, but from some of the people around him too. Izuku knew who Dabi was. He knew his past, what he's been through and what he inevitably became. Still, though, Izuku knew he wasn't all bad. He knew that Dabi was still caring at heart, as shown with his sister. This was why Izuku hoped that one day he would go and visit his mother. He would have to talk to him about that. Yui woke up the next day late. She was hours behind her usual wake-up schedule. Of course, she had also gone to bed fairly late as well. There were multiple reasons for that, she knew, the major one being the immense stress the attack had given her. Thoughts of, what if, and similar others plagued her mind constantly as possible scenarios played like a movie in her head. Some good, some bad. In all honesty, it scared her to some extent. When she wasn't thinking about that though, her mind and body was infested with something else she couldn't shake despite how hard she tried. The constant thoughts of hanging out with Izuku had a weird effect on her. It was odd. She never felt anything like it before. It was especially worse when she considered the thought of them alone together. Due to her very low understanding of basic human emotional understanding and meaning, she decided to look it up under the presence. What does it mean when I feel weird about someone? She thought it couldn't hurt to try and find some kind of explanation. A lot of the answers that came up confused her. The first thing she saw was something about trusting her gut and that weird feelings usually meant intuition. At first she thought, does this mean I'm intuitive about Izuku? But upon further investigation she found that was not the case, nor did it make sense. A lot of the top responses were about creepy feelings or feelings someone would have that were bad, which she knew wasn't the case. The feeling she got was hard to explain, but it carried a weird type of warmth to it. It was different from a fire type of warmth, unlike normal heat, or the warmth that One for All gave her when she used it. No, it was different. It was more comfortable and fuzzy, like she could snuggle up next to it all day. She changed the prompt she was searching for to, what does it mean when I have a warm feeling about someone? Needless to say the answers here were a lot more descriptive and informative. She had to go deeper to find out the full extent of her problem though, with some of the things even made her blush, which was extremely uncharacteristic of her. Apparently, the warm fuzzies meant that she was in love. At first she had no idea what being in love meant, or the implications it carried. She only knew that it was what she was feeling because the description of the feeling on multiple websites matched hers. She decided to go deeper into her research, searching, what does it mean to be in love? Needless to say this provided a lot more clarity to her and it helped her begin to understand. Apparently, being in love means desiring the happiness of your partner, admiring them for the individual they are, and feeling motivated to be a better person. If you are in love, you are driven to be compassionate, generous, and caring to your special someone. That was what the internet said, word for word, and that was exactly what she was feeling toward Izuku. But she was also still confused on a lot of the other stuff. Did being in love mean that they were even better friends? She always considered him a really good friend. Like, the bestest friend. She thought that calling one another by their given names signifies that. She looked that up too, and apparently it was something even greater than friendship. She was shell-shocked. There was something even greater than being friends. Yes, there was, apparently. There were stages to it, as well. In most cases it usually starts with a friendship, but if both parties mutually have greater feelings for one another it can evolve into what's called dating. Then, after that, it can go even further to something called lovers, but that one seems optional. Then if the two people mutually agree again they can become engaged, which leads to marriage. She's vaguely heard of the last two, mostly from her parents in an offhand line of dialogue they had. She never bothered to look into this stuff until now though, nor did she learn it in school or have anyone tell her about it. She found it all strangely fascinating, but that could just be because she was going through the possibility of it actually happening to her and wanted to know how to actually do things. She knew what being married meant, and vaguely about being engaged. It's as what her parents had, basically living together and whatnot. Now that she thought about it, why has it taken her so long to figure this stuff out? She shook her head, refocusing back onto the task at hand. Curiously, she searched, what are dates? And when some kind of plant came up she immediately changed her search to, what are couple dates? What came up was a lot of examples of what she could do on dates, as well as a definition on what it was. In summary, it was an event where two people got together to hang out and establish their connection to one another. There were apparently multiple ways people can go about going on a date, like simply playing games, watching a movie, or eating out. Before she could do anything else, her phone started to ring. Her eyes immediately snapped over to it and picked it up, quickly scanning the name of the calling. She unknowingly smiled at the name and answered the phone. Hello. Yui spoke into the phone quickly upon answering. Hey, Yui. How are things? He asked. Dare she believe she heard a bit of guilt in his voice. She was thankful for his concern. I'm alright, thank you. He hummed thoughtfully into the phone. Maybe he didn't really believe her. Well, that's good. I know things aren't exactly easy right now. She agreed. You were talking about hanging out yesterday. Wait, hanging out? That didn't mean that. Oh, yeah. He spoke, a bit unsure. I had some stuff earlier this morning to take care of, but I'm free for the rest of the day. I'm open to anything, if you're up to it. I'm not the best at social get-togethers. She deadpanned. Neither was she, but sure, give her the choice. It was comedic, in a way, so she didn't really mind. In the end, she chose something even she didn't really expect. How about we meet at my place? Your apartment over here. His voice suddenly changed. He seemed nervous. Are you sure? Positive. No, she wasn't positive, but she can't deny what she ultimately wants. Well, alright, I guess. If you're sure. He said. He himself was still unsure about it. The call ended shortly after that, mostly because Yui was rushing off of the phone for multiple reasons. For one, she had to get ready to meet him and officially get all the way over there. 2, she still felt weird and needed to sort that out. Was this going to be considered a date? This is what the websites said. Two people alone together doing things can be considered a date. So, was it or was it not? Yui would just assume that it wasn't go with that. She was curious, though. What exactly were lovers? Wouldn't she have to know if this date went well? Was it a date? If it was she needed to know, so logically she looked it up under, what do lovers do? At first she got a song from some really old band, so she changed her search to, what do lovers do in a relationship? There were a lot of things that came up, including kissing, which was something her parents did a lot, that involved the touch of two people's lips. The definition of a kiss was, touch with the lips as a sign of love, sexual desire, reverence, or greeting. So should she greet Izuku with a kiss when he got to her place? That didn't seem right, though, since kisses were something lovers did and they didn't even have their date yet. She'd do that later, she guessed. She was curious about some of the other stuff, too, so she decided it would be useful to research them in case of future use. This is where she started to develop uncharacteristic blushes and feelings even more. She looked up sexual desires, since it had been in the kiss definition. That ended up branching in many different directions. The definitions and practices were detailed, to say the least. She didn't indulge or get too carried away in looking at anything, though. She stopped herself before she got too deep, rightly recognizing that she wasn't ready for that kind of stuff yet. She did, however, know the basics of what it meant. She thoughtfully bookmarked the rest for a later date. With that, she decided she had enough of that and chose to get ready to go instead. She messaged Toshinori with a request to leave the premises to go to her apartment, which was approved. She got dressed in casual clothes, nothing that outright looked terrible but not something that looked too fancy either, and left. They had agreed to meet one another in around an hour and a half after the phone call, mostly for Yui's convenience at getting ready due to her distance. She got there with plenty of time to space and ended up waiting on her couch, eyes glued to the doors, as a nervous wreck. Sometimes she thought she was blessed for not being able to outwardly express emotion, because if she could then she would be a fidgeting mess. She had doubts about herself like, did she look good, was there something wrong with the place, and other similar thoughts. She didn't know why she thought that way though, but suspected it had to do with Izuku coming over. Eventually, she heard a knock at her door which made her instantly freeze. The fears and doubts crawled at the back of her mind like tiny spiders, almost tickling her brain. Reluctantly, she stood up from her previous sitting position on the couch and drug her feet toward the door. She told herself to look her best, so she put on a smile that she hoped properly welcomed him into her little place she called a vacation home. She opened the door, the smile on her face still. She immediately looked at her with a look of concern. Yui, are you alright? Crap, she wailed in her head, just settling back into her neutral expression. She wasn't sure why he suddenly asked that question, but what else was different about her usual look but the smile? So, she just got rid of it. I'm fine. He seemed to just study her for a moment, before relinquishing his concern. Yui internally sighed in relief. Yui stepped aside in an attempted gesture to welcome him inside, but he sort of just dumbly stared at her. She raised an eyebrow, truly unsure as to why he was still standing there. You are welcome to come in. Upon that statement, he seemed to finally realize the implication of her action. His face immediately turned into a tomato, which in Yui's opinion greatly contrasted to his broccoli hair. A part of her thought it was cute, actually, but that could have just been her love of tomatoes talking. But, she was also mildly concerned. Did she do something wrong? Was he embarrassed for some reason? Was he okay? After a few seconds, he seemed to recompose himself enough to respond, Thank you, Yui. Then he stepped into the apartment, finally. He was definitely nervous, she could read. Why? She hadn't a clue. She closed the door behind him as he took his shoes off, placing them right next to her own pair of shoes. He was forced to roam this place without any footwear now, while she was able to wear comfortable slippers. She felt bad about it, honestly. She wanted to extend that to him, but didn't have the materials to hand out. She could give him hers, but it was obvious that he wouldn't be comfortable with that. The two went further inside. Yui asked him if he wanted anything, but he politely declined. He hesitantly took a seat on the sofa while Yui took the time to prepare some tea, which she only recently learned how to make, just in case he wanted some. The awkwardness that hung in the air was incredibly noticeable, and Yui found herself internally panicking. A boy was in her place, alone, on a date, and they were just sitting there awkwardly. The websites she looked at gave her a whole list of things to do, so why couldn't she make the effort to suggest them? It was all just so frustrating. Coincidentally, when the tea finished, Izuku finally decided to speak. You play video games? The question was sudden and to the point. Usually, nothing would be wrong with that, especially if you were just asking that to a normal person. But Yui was not a normal person. She was far from normal. So, when he asked if she played video games, her head immediately snapped his way with a hint of a blush on her face. Did I forget to hide it before he came? She considered in the midst of her panic. Usually, she would play her games comfortably in the living area. She lived by her lonesome, or she used to, so there was no problem with it. The only people that occasionally came to see her were her parents, and she didn't really mind if they knew. But this was Izuku. Oh, she could only imagine what he must be thinking about her now. She was, in every sense of the word, doomed. But, to her surprise, he was curiously inspecting the console she had under her fairly large television. He seemed genuinely interested in it. What games do you have? He looked at her, his facial expression showing clear excitement. Despite her nervousness and fear, she could see the fascination in his face and dared to think he shared her interest in video games. She was shocked, to say the least. She thought he would think of her as a weirdo or something, considering that she heard that a lot of girls her age didn't usually play video games. Still, she bit down her nerves and responded to his question, I have a lot of hero fighting games. There are others too, but those are the main ones. They're in the room over there if you want to look. She gave a hesitant point in the direction of the room in question, in which he quickly went to investigate for himself. She was sort of just left there with her thoughts as he went back there. She didn't know what to think at the moment, but she did notice that the awkward atmosphere from before was somewhat dissipated now. She brought the tray of tea over to the table in front of the couch, taking her own seat as she waited for Izuku to come back. And, speak for the devil, he came back in about a minute holding a few games in his hand. I tried to find some of the best multiplayer games, he commented, looking at her with a genuine smile. A lot of them are story-based, so I had some trouble finding suitable multiplayer experience games. You have really great taste in games, Yui. She didn't know exactly what to make of the compliment, but something inside of her story stirred. She felt the comforting warmth she now knew was a particular feeling. It was nice. But, she had to ask, you're not weirded out. You like games. He gave her a small, light-hearted laugh. It was like he was genuinely amused by her question. But, he answered nonetheless in a full honest statement. Yeah, I like video games. Izumi and I like to play them in our spare time, sometimes. And no, I don't care about if you like them or not. I won't judge. She was utterly shocked by that statement. She didn't expect him to be so open and understanding about it. She threatened tears, almost. She was truly so glad to have someone in her life that wouldn't judge her and would stick by her side no matter who she was or did. She felt like she wanted to do the same for him, too. Was that normal? Now, he started, getting her attention. I bet I can beat you in a game of heroes versus villains. Ultimate. He was challenging her. He was really challenging her in a combat-based video game. She wanted to pinch herself to make sure it was real. Despite that urge, she gave him her best competitive glare and nodded. His smile increased by the smallest margin as he went to fish two controllers from next to the console. The next thing they knew was that they started the game and immediately got sucked in. They played for hours, the crown titled winner, constantly being passed between them like it was the potato in the game, hot potato. As they played for what felt like hours, Yui's mind couldn't help but drift back to what had happened the day prior to this. The attack. A game about heroes and villains would do that to you. After Izuku knocked out her character a little too easily, he knew something was up. He paused the game and turned to her, a look of concern on his face. She noticed his look and turned toward him as well. They both sort of just stared at one another until Izuku decided to speak up. Is everything alright, Yui? She ended up shifting her gaze away after the question. Really, no, she wasn't alright. Everything in the world was screwed up right now, and she didn't know what to do. She was supposed to succeed the symbol of peace, but it's something new. It was a huge responsibility and even harder with everything that was happening right now. But she unfortunately couldn't tell him that, despite how much she really wanted to. Maybe she could convince Toshinori to let her tell people about the secret, since it was now hers. Anyway, she decided to alter her concerns. Not really, she admitted sadly. There's just so much happening right now. I don't know how to deal with it. The attack yesterday was a message, and, I'm not sure, she ended up trailing off, but her general point had ended up getting sent. He looked at her for a moment before sighing. He put an arm around her in a side hug in an attempt to help comfort her. Yui found a strange warmth in his touch and an urge to lean into it, which she did. He then started to speak in a solemn and calm tone. I know how you feel, Yui. If I was given a sudden message like that, I wouldn't know how to receive it either. His answer intrigued her. He continued after letting out a sad sigh. When I was younger, people around me sent a clear message that I didn't receive. This led to a lot of unpleasant things happening. He glanced away. I think, for this, it's meant for the world. A message was sent to the world. A clear message. But, it's up to them to receive it. Or else. Yui understood, even as he trailed off. The message was, indeed clear. Izuku was right. It was up to the world to take the message that was sent to heart, or else the bad things Izuku compared the situation to would end up taking place. But, it concerned her. Izuku subtly shared something about his past that broke her heart. She pressed herself against him a little more, but she wasn't sure if it was for herself or for him. He needed to know that she was here for him, though. She hoped that he received that message through the contact. He spoke again. Yui, you're a hero. A very, very good hero. His voice was so genuine and sincere that it surprised her. Don't ever forget that it's never just your responsibility alone. She stared up at him, her eyes just a little more widened. She developed a small smile. You're a hero too. Her sudden declaration seemed to make him jolt in surprise, which was actually more amusing to Yui than annoying, since her comfortable position was compromised. I'm not a hero. I can't be a hero. He looked off to the side, somewhat flustered and even annoyed. She didn't let that bother or stop her, though. You're my hero, she confirmed, making him turn his head to look at her in mild shock. Her small smile never faltered. She was completely confident in this declaration. She then started to admit, albeit a little embarrassingly, you always keep inspiring me to keep moving forward. To keep being the best hero I can be. So, for that, you're my hero. He blushed and looked off to the side. She felt like she could just giggle at his facial expression. It really was amusing. After around a minute, he suddenly shouted, "All right. Back to the game, right Yui?" Oh dear, he looked like a deer in headlights. She'd better say yes to that question before he gets hit by the car. So, say yes to that question she did, and the two resumed their gaming session. Over time Yui felt as if her own worries were starting to dissolve and fade away. She didn't know the exact reason why, but she had her suspicions. During a break in their match, she spared a glance in his direction. He was focused on the screen, looking ahead with calculated and analytical eyes. He seemed to have recovered from his outburst earlier. Somehow, she knew it was because of him, and she couldn't be any happier about it on the inside. But, all good times must come to an end. In the middle of one of their games, Yui's phone violently buzzed. She paused the game, with Izuku giving her an odd expression. She was annoyed, but the call could be important, so she decided to check it out. When she looked to see who was calling her, she was surprised, to say the least. She didn't expect him to call her so soon. She answered the call. "Togata, what's Kota? It's Nighteye, he's been attacked. I'm on my way over there now." He started to say more, but Yui ended up drowning it out. Things just kept getting worse and worse, didn't they? I feel like I'm going to use a lot of UA staff meetings in the future. Ha. You'll see them a lot, I think, or at least different forms of them a lot in the future, probably. I found the Yui stuff, especially where she was looking up feelings and stuff, really fun to write. She's someone clueless about that sort of thing, so I think I did a decent job portraying that. I hope you all imagined Yui sitting at her computer for a long time just endlessly searching this stuff as entertaining as I did. Like, Izuku and Izumi are having a bit of a moment while Yui's having an existential crisis. Also, yeah, no action this chapter. I wanted to focus more on the aftermath of what happened and how everyone is moving forward and or trying to deal with it. You'll be getting action in the next chapter, though. A lot of it, actually. It'll be the main focus. I'm sure you know one of the main battles, just from the obvious context clues here, but there's another one I'm looking forward to in the next chapter. I'll tell you what, though, very soon you get a Mysterio fight. I was gonna put more of the Nighteye stuff in this chapter, but I felt like I'd take too long or something. Plus, I think I'd work better in the next chapter. I know that the warehouse was really bizarre, but like I said, you'll understand why it's that way in the future. I did give you a hint of a hint by referencing how the overhaul base was similar to it, along with another hint. They're very vague, but possible to figure out. Also, Dabi just received a huge upgrade and buff. I have an arc planned specifically for him later in the story, so I feel he needs to be at least a little stronger for it to successfully be used in the story. Scorpion and a few other new baddies will also be coming in soon, I should note. I'll actually tell you guys that I have a potential ending planned for the main story. It's not for a long way away, though, so don't worry about that too much. Just thought you should know that I'm looking ahead. I'm also gonna day now that Yui is gonna have her first major foe coming up, the after that it's Katsuki's turn to face his. And for those wondering, I have a lot planned for the Heroes Rising movie. It'll be different from what you all saw, but I have stuff planned for 9 in the plot of the movie. I'm not going to spill about anything regarding that stuff, though, as it's going to be a huge influence on the plot, I think, probably. Things may be subject to change. Shinso will be back soon, don't worry, I haven't forgotten about him. Well, I had to get this chapter out today. I felt like I would be behind again if I didn't. Also, it's Izuku and Mirio's birthday, so yeah. Or, at least it was when I wrote this. Whoops. I've had some internet issues for the past couple of days, too. I had some trouble with getting the work to save, in some cases had to start over again. So, again, sorry.